Chapter 593. Roll Call. The following students won prizes in the book review section: Murakami Xiaoshujun, Gathering and Dispersing Quicksand Ji, Evil Guangjun, Silenist, Gigu Lin Tianxian, Dreaker, Puyang Magic God, Super Colonel Black Star, Bozer Qifeng, Scorpion of November, 157 Qian, Shuyu 12121164722169. Please join the group and contact the moderator, Longing for Bamboo of Morning and Evening. Provide your information and receive the prize. I heard that you are all the highly praised contestants mentioned in this chapter. In the late winter of last year, Jingjiu left Aoyama with the other young people and moved to a courtyard outside Cloudy Town. Everything was a bit messy, so they spent the New Year's Day in a casual manner and had a hot pot. Zhao Leo was the only one who hugged him earnestly. Scenery Garden was peaceful this year. The students' cultivation went well, and the troublesome issues were solved. As a result, they decided to spend the New Year's Day in earnest, except for Jingjiu, who was still lying on the bamboo chair in a daze, thinking about something. Gu Qing, Zhuoruzhui, and Yuan Chu came to the front of the roofed corridor and knelt down in front of the bamboo chair. They kowtowed to it and stood up to leave, ready to continue their cultivation. They had been cultivating diligently this year, because they knew that Scenery Garden would be very dangerous in the future, even though it looked peaceful and beautiful at the moment. As they were about to walk out of the courtyard, Zhuoruzhui couldn't stand it anymore. He stopped and asked Jingjiu, Senior Grandmaster, "We've kowtowed to him. Even if you don't give him a red packet, when will you start cultivating?" As soon as he said this, Gu Qing, Yuan Chu, Ada and Cold Cicada on his head all looked in his direction, full of anticipation and desire. Jingjiu asked, "Is the spirit-gathering formation not easy to use?" Zhuoruzhui admitted that the formation in Scenery Garden was the most impressive one he had ever seen. It could attract the spiritual energy of the same density as that of Tianguang Peak in Cloudy Town, where there was no spiritual source. But, no matter how effective the formation was, it was not as effective as using it yourself. Zhao Lei knew what they were thinking and said, "It's too noisy and the spiritual qi is too violent. It will hurt us." As Jingjiu's cultivation grew higher and higher, the moment he began to absorb the spiritual energy of the world, he would be able to form a vortex that would draw in an unimaginable amount of spiritual energy. However, it was completely useless to him. Zhuoruzhui, Gu Qing, and Yuan Chu now know the reason. They leave with regret. Ada glanced at Jingjiu bitterly, thinking, "If they can't stand it, I can. You're just lazy." When night fell, Zhao Lei returned to the courtyard and celebrated the new year as usual. Jingjiu patted her head as a way of assuring her that he was safe. The next day was the first day of the new year. Outside the fog, which had been quiet for a long time, there was a sudden movement. Gu Qing raised his eyebrows, wondering what had happened. Then, he walked out with the sword of the universe in his arms. Zhuoruzhui followed behind him while yawning. The swallowing boat sword followed behind him listlessly. The two of them came to the front of the garden and found that it was not what they had expected. They knew all the visitors. Lei Aoqiang and Yao Songshan kneeled on the ground and bowed to the Scenery Garden, saying, "Greetings, Senior Grandmaster." Gu Qing and Zhuoruzhui stepped aside hurriedly. Lei Aoqiang and Yao Songshan stood up and bowed to them again. In the past year, none of the disciples of Aoyama had come to the Scenery Garden. They were the first ones. They had come here under the pressure of the masters of Aoyama. Perhaps they would be punished by the school rules when they returned. Gu Qing knew how much courage it took to do this, so he said earnestly, "Please come in and have a cup of tea." Lei Aoqiang and Yao Songshan said with a smile, "No need. We're just here to visit Senior Grandmaster. We're leaving now." After saying that, they left Cloudy Town on their sword. "I hope they'll be fine," Gu Qing said worriedly as he watched the two sword lights disappear among the mountains. "The law doesn't punish the majority. They should be fine," Zhuoruzhui said, pointing to the sky. Another few sword lights came from the sky. They were the disciples of Aoyama led by Lin Yingliang. Just like Lei Ilkyung and Yao Songshan, these disciples of Aoyama kowtowed to the scenery garden a few times and left. Not long after, another young disciple of Aoyama that Gu Qing and Zhuoruzhui didn't know arrived on his sword. This disciple of Aoyama should have just joined the school a few years ago. When he saw Gu Qing and Zhuoruzhui, he blushed and kowtowed to the scenery garden. He was so excited that his body trembled. Then, more sword lights lit up the sky. More and more young disciples of Aoyama arrived on their swords. They must have noticed that the masters of Aoyama didn't stop them. The sky above Cloudy Town was filled with endless sword lights. Flying swords landed outside the fog from time to time. In just half a day, at least 100 disciples of Aoyama came to pay their respects to Jingjiu. 164 people. Gu Qing said to Jingjiu, "I've memorized all their names." Zhuoruzhui was listening at the side. He felt a great pressure. He thought that he had counted in his heart and there were indeed 164 people. But did he still need to memorize all their names? Yuan Chu didn't feel any pressure. He didn't want to be the sect master anyway. He just wondered if he should go to the Shangda Peak to kowtow to the great ancestor and talk to junior sister Yushan. Zhao Lei looked at Jingjiu sitting on the bamboo chair and thought that some things were worth it. Jingjiu said while looking at the sky, "The weather is good today." Zhuoruzhui followed his line of sight and found that the clouds and fog were still hanging in the sky. The scenery was as beautiful as ever, but it couldn't be said that the weather was good. Jingjiu continued, "We can have a hot pot." By now, everybody realized that it wasn't the weather that was good, but the mood that was good. It didn't take long before a large double-duck pot appeared by the stream under the flowering trees. It was impossible for Shuriwe Peak to send them freshly cut beef and mutton, but the Gu clan and the Precious Treehouse were good at this kind of business. Zhao Lei scooped a bowl of bone soup for Jingjiu. Jingjiu picked up the bowl and clinked it with the others like the others did. Everybody was stunned. Jingjiu went to lie under the eave after eating 2 green vegetables. The flowing stream formed a small pond at a bend, and the koi carps were swimming slowly in the pond. The color of the koi carps was similar to the color of the flowering trees by the bank. Lying on the bamboo chair, Jingjiu looked at the koi carps, thinking of the king of fire carps at the bottom of the cold mountain, the green sky mirror, and Qing. She was the true spirit of the heavenly state, but she didn't have much fighting prowess. And she was still a little child, so she could be deceived easily. She had been deceived by Lu Ci to travel to the alien land for 3 years. Thinking of Lu Ci, Jingjiu thought of Yuan Qijing and the emperor in Zhaoga City. Jingjiu's eyelashes quivered slightly as he thought of the king of the underworld. He didn't have many friends, but the king of the underworld was one of them. Jingjiu suddenly asked, "How is he?" Yuan Chu was staring at Zhuoruzhui's shoulder, and was about to snatch the bowl from him. Hearing this, he put down the chopsticks and bowl in his hands hastily, saying, "He's still being stubborn." Jingjiu uttered and said, "Put him out." The word "put out" was usually used to describe objects, utensils and antiques, but not a person. Yet, that person was inside a blue ice cube. The blue ice cube was placed in the middle of the courtyard. It had been a while since they left the Shanghai Peak, but the blue ice cube didn't melt completely. Instead, 1/3 of the ice cube melted neatly, exposing Apiao's head. It was Cold Cicada's ability to do it so precisely. Apiao's small face was exposed outside the ice, and the lower part of her black hair was in the ice. As she turned her head, she looked a bit comical, but also a bit adorable. "I do want the seal of the king of the underworld, but I won't betray my teacher." Staring at Jingjiu on the bamboo chair, he continued angrily, "No matter how you humiliate and tempt me, I won't agree to take you as my teacher." Gu Qing and the others looked at Jingjiu, and found that he had no intention of paying any attention to this child of the underworld, so they looked at the hot pot again. Master, the meat is ready, Yuan Chu said to Zhao Liu respectfully. Zhao Liu picked up the chopsticks and picked up some meat, saying, "Let's eat." No sooner had she finished saying this than the sword wills arose in the courtyard. The gentle wind ruffled the flowering trees and the stream water, and the sword sounds could be vaguely heard. Apiao found it odd that nobody paid any attention to him. He turned his head in that direction and saw the hot pot and those people eating it. Zhuoruzhui's chopsticks fell down like the wind, and the meat rose up like a forest. Gu Qing's chopsticks moved very steadily, and he never missed anything. The chopsticks in Yuan Chu's hands seemed to have some kind of twist and turn, and he could always find a gap between the other two pairs of chopsticks and insert them into the hot pot. Seeing the residual shadows created by the chopsticks, Apiao was stunned, thinking that this sword style was truly formidable. The disciples of Aoyama actually practiced their swordsmanship even when they were eating. No wonder they were so strong. At this time, Zhao Liu finished eating the meat on her plate and raised her chopsticks towards the hot pot. Thus, the chopsticks' shadows that were like the wind, and the sword sounds that were incessant, all disappeared. Zhuoruzhui and the others held their chopsticks, quietly waiting for her to go first. Apiao came back to her senses and looked at Jingjiu, continuing, "A teacher for a day, a father for a lifetime. I appreciate your appreciation of me, but if you want me to betray my teacher and go to another school, that won't do." Hearing this, Zhuoruzhui clicked his tongue a few times and said to Yuan Chu, "This little fellow really belongs to your school. Look at how thick his skin is." Yuan Chu smiled and said, "In terms of skin thickness, other than Master No, who can compare to you?" Zhuoruzhui knocked Yuan Chu's chopsticks with his chopsticks and said, "I admire you. You dare to think of it, and you almost said it out loud." Gu Qing said with a small smile, "We are a family now, there is no need to distinguish between you and me." Hearing what Apiao said, Jingjiu said, "I'm good at persuading your master's students and disciples to betray him." He had said this to the underworld master many years ago, but Apiao hadn't heard it before, and she didn't know the story of how he led the two most outstanding disciples of Taiping Zhenren, Yuan and Lu, to kill his master more than 300 years ago. She couldn't help but be taken aback. Apiao suddenly smelled a delicious smell, and looked in that direction again. Looking at the boiling soup in the copper pot and those oddly shaped ingredients, the glows in her small face began to flow vaguely, as she exclaimed in a trembling voice, Is this the rumored hot pot of Izhou?" Gu Qing picked up a piece of black tripe and swung it slowly in the red soup. His movements were slow and graceful, and his voice was as gentle as a zither. "Yes, it's from the House of 9 Fragrances." Hearing what he said, Apiao stared at his chopsticks, and the expression on her face suddenly changed, as she exclaimed, "It's 16 times!" As the disciples of the royal family of the underworld, the change in their expressions was too obvious to be concealed, just like their moods. Gu Qing picked up the piece of black tripe and put it in Yuan Chu's bowl. "Do you want to try it?" he asked Yuan Chu with a small smile. Apiao was frozen in the ice cube, and she couldn't even raise her hands. How could she eat the hot pot? If she wanted to come out of the ice cube, she had to agree to Jingjiu's conditions. "Humph! You guys can't entice me. I can even give up the seal of the king of the underworld, let alone a hot pot." Apiao angrily turned her face away, determined not to look at him again, but she couldn't help but slowly turn her face back. Gu Qing smiled and didn't say anything, and everyone continued to eat the hot pot. Apiao watched them finish the tripe and yellow aorta, and the beef and mutton were almost gone. Her eyes gradually became resentful, and she painfully swallowed a few mouthfuls of saliva. She shouted with grief and indignation, "Stop! I surrender!" Surrendering without hesitation was not trustworthy. Apiao was very clear that she had to agree to Jingjiu's conditions and make a blood oath of the Styx River. After the blood oath of the Styx River was made, she could no longer resist Jingjiu's orders. unless she chose death or endured endless pain and changed all the blood in her body into the sacred water of the Styx River. Thinking of the bleak future, although Ah Piao had decided to surrender, she still hesitated for a while before closing her eyes. Her lips trembled slightly, and she seemed to be very afraid. Jingjiu clenched his right fist and stretched out his index finger to touch the space between Ah Piao's eyebrows. The seal of the king of the underworld was in his hand, emitting 2 rays of black and gold light, giving off an extremely solemn yet sacred feeling. Ah Piao's bangs rose without any wind, revealing a small slit between her eyebrows. A wisp of soul fire floated out and entered his palm along Jingjiu's index finger. Finally, it merged with the seal of the king of the underworld. After putting the seal of the king of the underworld back, Jingjiu's left hand stroked the surface of the ice. The extremely hard and cold ice instantly broke into hundreds of small pieces, and then was burned into mist by the sword fire, merging with the mist in the hot pot and the mist on the surface of the stream. Ah Piao lay on the ground. Her face was pale, and her body was drenched. She looked extremely weak. Her sapphire blue robe was torn in many places, revealing her jade-like skin. "She's quite white," commented Yuan Chu while holding a plate and shoveling shrimp into his mouth. Zhuoruzhui chewed the chili rings and cured meat at the same time and said, "There's no sun in the underworld. How can she not be white?" Zhao Lei felt something was wrong. She was slightly startled. She grabbed the back of Ah Piao's neck and dashed to the backyard. Squatting on Jingjiu's shoulder, Ada was about to see what the seal of the king of the underworld looked like. Suddenly, he saw Zhao Lei's movement, and he couldn't help but feel nervous. It didn't take long for Zhao Lei to bring the drifter back to the field. Ah Piao had taken a bath and changed into a clean set of clothes. She even combed her hair into a ponytail, which matched with her delicate eyes and brows. She looked really cute. Zhuoruzhui was shocked and said, "How come you've become a little girl?" Gu Qing and Yuan Chu were also very surprised. The drifter pouted her small mouth and said indignantly, "I'm a girl." Chapter 594. Jingjiu looked at the little bai and on Ah Piao's head and thought it looked familiar. He recalled that he had made one for Zhao Lei at the beginning of the Shenma Peak. Ah Piao's little bai and should be her handiwork. Zhao Lei seemed to be very satisfied with her handiwork. She flicked the little bai and with her finger. Jingjiu said, "I made it look better for you." There was a hint of regret in his words, which Zhao Lei understood. She said, "I don't like it. There were many things in life that one had to do without, that one couldn't get what one wanted, and that one had to leave. For example, the white soup in the hot pot always dried up first. Zhao Lei didn't want to keep her hair long. Everyone would leave." Jingjiu thought it through. When the emperor gave him the egg for safekeeping, it meant that he was entrusting his orphan to him. There were still a few years left, so he should make good use of it. Jingjiu raised his head and looked at the people who were still eating the hot pot. He said, "I'm going to class today." Ah Piao had just rushed to the table excitedly with her chopsticks when she heard this. She couldn't help but feel inexplicably sad. Aoyama imitates all things with the sword. That's why there's the saying of all in one. Hearing the first sentence of Jingjiu's introduction, the disciples in the courtyard felt it a bit odd. It wasn't that this was a bad idea. Gu Qing and Yuan Chu had received similar instructions before. The problem was that all-in-one was not only a swordsmanship and a state, but also a sword. And now that sword was talking in front of them. It was fine when it wasn't mentioned, but who wouldn't think about it when it was mentioned? Jingjiu naturally didn't care about what they were thinking. He said, "The formations, thunder techniques, talisman techniques, and Taoism techniques of the various cultivation sects can all be imitated by sword techniques. This is the origin of the true sword of the Nine Peak. There are thousands of great Taos, and in the end they are all connected. You can't understand them, but it's enough for you to understand the true meaning of swordsmanship." The disciples in the courtyard calmed themselves down and listened attentively. How many people in the world would have the opportunity to listen to perfected Jing-yang personally explain the way of the sword? Before this life, only Zen master had had this kind of opportunity. The sword is used to cut things, whether it's a cucumber or a human head. In short, it's used to cut things into 2 or more pieces. Jingju said, to understand the true meaning of swordsmanship, one must learn how to sever. This logic was even simpler, even a little tacky, but everyone still listened very seriously. Everything has a gap, and that is where the light can shine in. Jingju walked into the courtyard and pointed at a porcelain bottle, saying, "Just like this bottle." Everyone was stunned, thinking that this porcelain bottle was so smooth and tight, how could there be a seam? Gu Qing also knew that this bottle was a precious porcelain that the Gu family had specially bought from a famous kiln. Logically speaking, there shouldn't be any flaws. Raise it higher. Jingju walked behind the porcelain bottle and stretched out his right hand. Without a sound, there seemed to be a sun on his fingertip, emitting endless light. Everyone was unprepared and almost blinded by the light. After a while, they came back to their senses and walked to the other side of the porcelain bottle. They saw that there were many tiny cracks on the porcelain bottle that had looked like a hole. The so-called cracks were actually the boundary between the light and the light, not the real gap. Where the light can enter, the sword can enter. The intersection of light and darkness is also the way of the sword. Jingju said, "The way of the sword is simple, and there are not so many things to pay attention to." Zhuoruzhui thought of the sword manuals he had read after he entered the sect and the extremely complicated sword techniques he had learned. He frowned and said, "If that is the case, then the state is not important at all?" Jingju said, "The difference between states is how far your sword can fly, how fast it can fly, and how accurate it is." Gu Qing said thoughtfully, "The distance is actually not important." Decades ago, when he participated in the inherited sword competition in Aoyama for the first time, his state was higher than Jingju's, but he was defeated by Jingju's sword. Of course, he would not forget what happened that day. As long as the flying sword can't reach you, there is no difference between the initial state of the broken sea and the peak state of the broken sea. Jingju said, "If your state is not high enough, try to shorten the distance between you and your opponent. If your opponent has reached the heavenly arrival state, it will be a different story." It was still so simple. Was it really so simple? Then why could you kill the immortal Tai Lu? Apiao's voice came up from below. It turned out that she had been kneeling on the ground, holding the porcelain bottle with both hands, like a painter facing a flower shelf. A pretty and lovely girl was kneeling on the ground with both hands raised. It was really pitiful. It was obvious that this was a punishment. Ada lay on the bamboo chair and clicked his tongue in wonder at the scene. He had no sympathy for the devil men of the underworld, and they were all the same targets. Yet, he didn't expect these descendants of Aoyama in Scenery Garden to be so unfeeling. Jingju said to Apiao, "It's because I'm me." Apiao had never seen such a shameless and narcissistic person in her life, but she didn't dare complain, not even criticizing him in her mind. Though she hadn't witnessed the formidable power of the blood oath of the underworld river, she had heard of it many times since her childhood. "Teacher, I can't practice the sword work of Aoyama, so it's useless to listen to all this. As my teacher, you have to teach me something." Apiao lifted her small face and looked at Jingju with a pitiful expression. According to the usual practice, or to be more precise, the practice when Taiping Jinren took in the underworld masters, she called Jingju teacher instead of master. Jingju said, "I'll teach you the control of soulfire in 3 years. Apiao protested, "Back when the royal granduncle gave you the seal of the king of the underworld, you must have promised him that you would teach me. Why did you have to wait 3 years? Jingju said, "What I promised was to choose an heir for him, and then teach that heir the control of soulfire. The meaning of this statement was clear. Jingju didn't need to choose Apiao to be the next king of the underworld, so he didn't need to teach her the control of soul fire. Apiao felt it was a difficult life to live. She said tearfully, "All right, what should I do in the next 3 years? Wait to be tested by you, or take care of your daily life?" Jingjiu thought she was far inferior to Lu Shisui and Gu Qing in this aspect, so he said, "I'll teach you the art of being an emperor." Apiao was taken aback, asking, "What?" Jingjiu explained, "I'll teach you how to be an emperor." Everybody, including Zhao Liu, fixed their gazes on Jingjiu, full of bewilderment and bewilderment. It was a troublesome thing to be an emperor, no matter whether it was the emperor in the human world or the king of the underworld in the underworld. Yet, Jingjiu, who was the laziest person in the human world, wanted to teach others how to be an emperor? Jingjiu sensed the distrust in their eyes, feeling puzzled. "I've been an emperor and I've done a good job," he said. Except for Apiao, everybody present knew that Jingjiu referred to the emperor of the Chu kingdom, who had been in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror for several decades. In the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, Zhao state and Qin state were extremely powerful, and Chu state had a soft and gentle temperament. As a result, the Chu kingdom could survive in such a dangerous environment for several decades, and lived a good life. One had to admit that the ruler of the Chu kingdom had a good administration, but was it because of Jingjiu? It was all because of Grand Secretary Zhang. Zhuoruzhui had lived with Jingjiu in the royal palace of the Chu kingdom for many years, so he knew what had happened. He winked at Apiao hastily. Apiao didn't know what had happened. She nodded her head foolishly when she heard Jingjiu say that she had been an emperor, and Zhuoruzhui winked at her. Zhao Liu turned around, Gu Qing covered his forehead with his hands, and Yuan Chu lowered his head. They couldn't bear to see the scene. It was late at night. The stars were blocked by the clouds and fog in the high sky. It was dark in the courtyard, except for the gurgling sound of water. Such a night was the best time to watch the feeble lights, like the fireflies and Apiao's soul fire. Jingjiu looked at the cold and gloomy little flame in front of him in silence, reflecting on something. Apiao's face was a bit pale. It was not difficult for her to keep her soul fire outside her body for a while, but she was too nervous to keep her soul fire in front of Jingjiu. As a result, it consumed a lot of her soul fire. After a long while, Jingjiu motioned for her to take back her soul fire, saying, "Remember to remind me to tell you the story of the fiend prison when you have time." The time spent in the fiend prison with the underworld was an interesting memory for Jingjiu. He hoped that the underworld would know about it and pass it on as long as possible. Apiao nodded repeatedly and asked, "Teacher, is the method of being an emperor very difficult?" "It's very simple to be an emperor. First of all, you have to know the right people, and then you have to use the right people. The last and most important thing is that you don't move." Jingjiu continued calmly while looking at her. "It's because you're the emperor. No matter whether your idea is correct or not, the people in the world have to follow your lead. But it's not reasonable." It was like Taiping Zhenren, who founded the Plum Meeting and created the peace for 1,000 years. He was the leader of the Orthodox sects recognized by the whole world. In a sense, he was the real emperor of Chaotian. Jingjiu looked at the night sky and waved his sleeve a few times. The clouds and fog in the sky dispersed, exposing the bright stars. The starlight shone on Cloudy Town and every place in Chaotian, and it must be shining on that person. What was he doing now that he had succeeded in total transformation? The world in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror had woken up a long time ago. The White Emperor of the Qin kingdom had died suddenly, and the world was in turmoil. It took a few years for the peace to be restored. The Qi kingdom and the Zhao kingdom had succeeded in restoring the Qin kingdom, and the Qin kingdom had returned to its original territory. The situation in the Chu kingdom was similar, except that the late emperor didn't have a descendant. In the end, the chancellors and the scholars decided to appoint the royal dowager, Zhao, as the new ruler. The royal dowager Zhao was very generous to the former Chu kingdom, so the aristocratic families and chancellors of the Chu kingdom still enjoyed a high status. The eldest son of the former Grand Secretary Zhang was one of them. For various reasons, the eldest young Master Zhang enjoyed a high status in the hearts of these aristocratic families and chancellors, but he didn't want to move away from his hometown, staying in the countryside. Though he had no intention of making a name for himself, his reputation grew higher and higher. Many people came to visit him. The royal dowager Zhao even issued a few decrees to invite him to meet her in the capital of Zhao. The eldest young Master Zhang didn't want to see anybody, nor did he pay attention to the royal dowager Zhao. He led his family in growing vegetables in the countryside. However, he couldn't grow vegetables like before. The neighboring houses and fields had been expropriated by the imperial court and sent to his family. That large piece of mountaintop had a name, Zhang Garden. The eldest young Master Zhang would go to the neighboring courtyard every day. It had been his neighbor. There was a well in the courtyard. The eldest young Master Zhang would look at the bottom of the well every day with his hands folded behind his back, muttering to himself, "Oh, the fish, where have you been?" The fish didn't come back, but the bird did. A blue bird landed on a branch and shook her head while looking at the skinny and bare-chested eldest young Master Zhang. The flow of time in the green sky mirror was the same as that in the outside world, indicating that it was becoming more and more real. She was satisfied with the result, but she was not satisfied with the eldest young Master Zhang. The blue bird turned into a flash of lightning, piercing through the sky and traveling around the world. She found that the pirates on the ocean were preparing to launch a counterattack against the state of Zhao, feeling speechless. She shook her head again and flapped her wings to create a hurricane, which prevented the pirates from attacking the state of Zhao for a few years. The more real the world was, the more likely it was to fall into the boring repetition, like a human being. The blue bird left the green sky mirror with a hint of tiredness, and landed on another branch. A sound suddenly broke out in the sky. A crimson bird landed right by the blue bird's side. The blue bird turned his head. His black eyes were sparkling. They met. Chapter 595. The flow of time in the green sky mirror was different from that in the real world, and the flow of time in Chaotian might be different from that in the outside world, but the direction of the flow of time would never change. It would always move forward dully and cruelly. On an ordinary day, Ping Yongka had finally woken up on the top of the Sword Peak. Time had covered his body with dust, but he didn't feel anything. He felt that he had slept very soundly, and his whole body was comfortable. He subconsciously stretched his body. His body emitted light popping sounds, and then the surrounding cliffs also exploded like a storm. Pa-pa-pa-pa. Innumerable invisible sword wills spread out along with his open hands, falling on the hard cliff rocks and leaving countless marks. The falling stones rustled and instantly piled up on the ground. He jumped down from the cliff cave and looked at the clear and deep sword marks on the cliff wall. He was shocked, speechless. He looked at his hands and thought, what happened? After thinking for a long time, he still couldn't figure it out, so he didn't bother to think about it anymore. He walked around the mountain casually, trying to see if he could pick up a sword that caught his eye. Countless noises could be heard coming from the peaks. Gravel rolled and the sword intent gradually grew. Dozens of flying swords and sword embryos flew out from the ground and the cracks in the rock. Speaking of which, it was strange. When he came to the Sword Peak to search for swords, the swords in the Sword Peak had all flown out by themselves. But today was a little different. When Ping Yongka stretched out his hand to take a look at a sword that was pleasing to the eye, the sword retreated and avoided his hand. Ping Yongjiao was taken aback. He reached out his hand in an attempt to grab the other sword, but the other sword rolled a few times on the ground and dodged his hand. "If you don't want to be taken by me, Then why did you come out to see me? Feeling baffled, Ping Yongjiao walked forward. Those flying swords parted as he walked, as if the tide was parted. Just like that, he walked on the sword peak. At least hundreds of flying swords appeared to greet him and then evade him. He vaguely understood that it wasn't that these swords didn't want to follow him, but that they were in awe of him and felt inferior. I say, what's going on? Standing on a large rock, Ping Yongka looked at the hundreds of flying swords in the mountains and said innocently, "Can't I not dislike you?" The flying swords lowered their heads slightly. It was unknown whether it was a sign of submission or disbelief. The cry of an iron eagle came from high above the clouds, as if it was responding to Ping Yongka. Ping Yongka had no choice but to descend the Yunqing Peak with a face full of dirt and grime. He thought to himself that he still hadn't gotten the sword. He had really lost face for his master. When he arrived at the foot of Yunqing Peak, he met a few disciples of Aoyama. He naturally greeted them as senior brother. The Aoyama disciples thought that he was a new inner sanctum disciple, so they did not pay much attention to him. They just hummed in acknowledgement and continued to walk forward without stopping. There are more than a dozen more people going to Scenery Garden to kowtow this year. A few days ago, there were also people going to Youth Full Moon. It's really, have those fellow disciples gone mad? That's clearly a monster, yet you're worshipping it like an ancestor. Don't talk nonsense like that. Nobody has any proof. Don't you see that even the disciples of Shilai Peak don't say that now? If he's not a sword monster, why didn't he dare to take out the inherited heaven sword that year? What born shapeless sword body? He's just a sword. Only those lunatics would believe him. Lunatics? Let's not talk about the disciples of Shenma Peak. Is senior brother Zhuoruzhui also a lunatic? Ping Yongka had walked more than 100 feet away, but he overheard the conversation, especially the last few sentences. He was stunned on the spot. A breeze rose. He turned around and came to the back of those disciples of Aoyama and asked, "Senior brother, what are you talking about?" Those disciples of Aoyama looked at each other and felt strange. They thought that everyone in Aoyama knew about this. What did you want to ask? No one had the patience to talk too much to a new inner disciple. Ping Yongka didn't have the patience to listen to the whole story. When he learned that it had been more than 4 years since the grand ceremony of Aoyama and what happened during the ceremony, he turned around and ran to Shenma Peak, his face as pale as a piece of paper. A dust dragon rolled up countless grass chip. He ran from Yunqing Peak to the bottom of Shenma Peak at an unimaginable speed. The prohibition of Shenma Peak had been activated. The mountain was filled with sword wills, blocking the path to the top. Standing at the entrance of the mountain path, Ping Yongka could clearly feel the power and terror of the prohibition. He heard that his master and senior aunt almost failed to go up. How could he? However, when he thought of what those senior brothers said, he couldn't just stand outside the peak. His master was a monster? How was that possible? The forbidding formation of Shenma Peak was activated. Did it mean that he, Senior Master Zhao and 2 big brothers were all imprisoned? Was Senior Brother Zhua also imprisoned? How were they now? The strong worry, uneasiness, and guilt gave him great courage. He clenched his teeth and ran up the mountain path. There was a light smack. Ping Yongka had just taken 1 step up the mountain path when he stopped. He looked down at his right leg and found a straight wound below his knee. Blood was slowly flowing out from it. The wound was also gradually opening up, revealing the white bone. He was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses. The intense pain squeezed his eyebrows together. He opened his mouth, but couldn't make a sound for a long time. Indistinct cries of apes came from somewhere in front of him. Ping Yongka became a little more clear-headed. He tore off a piece of his sleeve and carefully bandaged the wound. After doing this, his face was as pale as a piece of paper. He kept shouting in a slightly hoarse voice, "It hurts! It hurts! It hurts!" The cries of the apes sounded again, as if they were mocking him. Ping Yongka couldn't be bothered with them. He sat on the ground and kept blowing at the wound. At the same time, he kept talking to himself. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't hurt. After a long time, the pain finally subsided a little. When he looked at the seemingly quiet mountain path again, there was more fear in his eyes. But no matter how scared he was, he still had to go up. Ping Yongka suddenly closed his eyes. His expression gradually calmed down, as if he had fallen asleep, just like when he was in the Sword Peak. After a short while, he slowly stood up, closed his eyes, and walked towards the mountain path. There was nothing in front of him, but he suddenly lifted his right foot and stepped over a non-existent obstacle. Then he turned right. Then Ping Yongka became a puppet. It was as if he was being pulled by an invisible rope, moving forward or backward, turning or retreating on the mountain path. Strangely, he didn't get hurt by the sword wills anymore as he walked like this. Only a few corners of his clothes would be cut off from time to time, which showed how dangerous it was. After an hour, he finally came to the middle of Shinma Peak. There were a few thin bloodstains on his face, and his clothes were in tatters. He seemed to have met with some trouble here. He stopped for a long time. Ping Yongka suddenly cursed. He opened his eyes bravely, took a deep breath, and jumped forward. I jump. I jump. I jump. So the puppet turned into a rabbit and jumped forward on the mountain path. After an unknown amount of time, he actually jumped to the peak just like that. The top of Shinma Peak was deserted. The stone door of the abode of immortals was closed. Withered leaves fell on the Taoist temple. It looked very bleak. The abode of immortals was a place to sleep, the Taoist temple was a place to watch the snow, and the cliff was a place to step on the clouds. The sea of clouds was the same as yesterday. It would snow in winter. But those people were gone. The bamboo chair that he used to lie on was also gone. Looking at the familiar yet strange scenery in front of him, Ping Yongka felt very lonely. He couldn't help but feel sad. His master was betrayed by those scoundrels. Instead of being imprisoned in Shinma Peak, he was driven out of Aoyama. He probably wouldn't live long. Even if it was a place that could be regarded as home, it was meaningless without people. Ping Yongka walked down the mountain in a daze. He didn't know whether the restriction on Shinma Peak was special, or the sword wills all over the mountain knew who he was. He didn't encounter any problems. Not long after, he arrived at the small wooden hut at the bottom of the cliff. The small wooden hut had been uninhabited for a long time. The dust on the steps was full of monkeys' footprints. The black tea was overturned everywhere, but the green tea was still in the jar. Those monkeys knew that Gu Qing had been drinking green tea all these years, so they didn't harm it. Ping Yongka looked at the green tea in the jar and felt sad. Where was senior brother Gu Qing? Could he come back to drink tea? He left the small wooden hut and went to the stream. In those years, he often came here to pick up the stones that Master Ant cut with the thoughtless sword. Sometimes he would ride the horse. Where did the horse go? Ping Yongka looked around the mountain stream and suddenly found a slightly raised pile of stones. The sword light flashed in his eyes, and he saw clearly what was inside. The horse was already dead. So many years had passed. Ping Yongka walked to the pile of stones and touched them gently. He rubbed his eyes and didn't say anything. The cries of the monkeys were getting closer. The treetops bent slightly and the wild wind blew. The monkeys jumped out of the forest and surrounded him. They patted his back and hands carefully to comfort him. Thank you, Ping Yongka said sincerely with red eyes. He didn't think these monkeys were annoying anymore. He thanked the apes for comforting him, and thanked them even more for the good burial of the horse. A moment ago, the atmosphere by the stream was very gloomy. The next moment, Ping Yongka broke down. He shouted angrily at the foot of the peak, "I'll kill you bastards with my sword." The angry shouts echoed in the mountains and flowed down the peak together with the stream. Silence. The monkeys looked at him. Most of their eyes fell on his right hand. After the Aoyama sword cultivator reached the undefeated state, he could merge with the flying sword. Not having a sword in his hand didn't mean he didn't have one. But the monkey's meaning was very clear. "Where's your sword?" Ping Yonka said innocently, "It's a bit complicated. It's not that I can't get the sword. The key is those swords." Before he could finish, an old ape suddenly walked in from outside. Obviously, this old monkey had a very high status among the monkeys. All the monkeys stopped talking and looked at him in awe. The old monkey walked to Ping Yonka. He slowly took his hand and walked to the cliff on the other side of the stream. Ping Yonka was stunned at first. Then he remembered the stories he read when he was young and couldn't help but feel ecstatic. Silence. The monkeys stood on the other side of the stream and watched the old monkey take Ping Yonka across the mountain stream and disappear into the wild forest. There was a steep cliff on the other side of the wild forest. There were many green vines on the cliff. The place with the densest vines hid a cave. Chapter 596. Reverend Jingyang had left behind countless treasures on Shinma Peak. Even he had forgotten some of them. However, what he remembered was enough to ensure that Zhao Liu and the others would have enough for their cultivation. As such, these disciples of Shinma Peak had never worried about the magic pills and the like over the last few decades. However, when Ping Yonka pushed open the stone door of the cave and saw the flying swords and the bottle of elixirs on the shelf, he couldn't help but become excited. It was a pure green jade bottle sealed with Yamatsai's talisman paper. Not a single bit of aura leaked out. One could imagine how precious the elixirs inside were. Those swords were also not ordinary items. However, what made Ping Yonka feel somewhat helpless was that when he walked in front of those swords, he once again felt the reverence and inferiority of those swords. Since these swords couldn't be used, then he might as well take some elixirs. Ping Yonka naturally knew that elixirs couldn't be taken carelessly. However, he was in a hurry to improve his cultivation level. He also thought that since the old ape had brought him here, there shouldn't be any problems. In those stories, have you ever seen a hero who jumped off a cliff to find a treasure only to die because of these reasons? Fortuitous encounters were never a problem. Thinking of the loneliness on Shinma Peak and the discussion of those Aoyama disciples, a ruthless expression flashed across his face. He picked up the green jade bottle, tore off the talisman paper, and poured the elixir into his mouth without hesitation. Seeing this, the old ape couldn't help but be stunned. "It's quite crunchy. It's a bit like yellow throat." Ping Yonka chewed the elixirs like beans. Looking at the old ape's expression, he said, "Ah, sorry, I forgot to leave one for you." The old ape suddenly let out a strange cry and ran out of the cave without looking back. He didn't forget to close the stone door. Ping Yonka wondered what this meant. Just as he was about to chase after it and ask a few questions, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his stomach. His expression changed. The old ape left the cave as fast as it could. It passed through the stream and returned to the group of monkeys, drenched all over. It let out a sharp cry to signal the monkeys to quickly hide in the forest. The monkeys did not know what had happened and retreated into the woods in a panic. It was not until they had retreated several miles that they felt slightly relieved. The old macaque climbed to the treetop and looked in the direction of the cave abode. Its eyes were filled with worry and anger. The potency of that medicinal pellet was extremely strong. Even if one wanted to break through to the free travel state, one pellet would be enough. Moreover, it would take at least a year of closed-door cultivation to dissipate. Ping Yonka had actually consumed a bottle without a care in the world. He would definitely explode and die, and the entire cliff might even collapse from the impact. Just as it was thinking about this, the treetops suddenly shook. The monkeys in the woods screamed and staggered. Some of the little monkeys even fell from their mothers. Countless waves rose from the stream, and dust rose from the ground. It was actually an earthquake. Boom! A thunderous sound came from the cliff. In the next moment, another clap of thunder sounded. The cliff shook again, and the stream became restless again. It was not over yet. The claps of thunder continued, and the ground kept shaking. It was not until a long time later that the ground calmed down. The monkeys in the woods also calmed down. They looked in the direction of the cliff, full of curiosity and uneasiness. The old ape looked in that direction, its aged eyes full of sympathy and sadness. It had been many years since such a naive or idiotic child had appeared in the Aoyama sect. The prohibition on Shinhwa Peak was set up by Jingyang himself. It was extremely powerful and mysterious. No one could enter it and no one could see it, but the wind and rain could. It was early winter. A snowfall arrived on time and fell on the peak top. The windows of the Taoist temple were open, but nobody was looking at them. The snow also fell in the woods below the cliff. The monkeys stared at a certain spot without moving. The snow on their heads made them look very cute. The old ape took a fruit from one of its descendants and casually took a bite before tossing it to the youngest one under the tree. It continued to look in that direction. The cliff on the other side had already collapsed, and that cavern was buried inside. That naive idiot was definitely dead, but the problem was that the apes were still unable to get close to that side. There was a vague formation intent and extremely powerful force that isolated the cliff from the outside world. The old ape was somewhat cautious, so it ordered its descendants to keep an eye on that place. In the following days, more snow fell. It was early spring, and another year had passed. One morning, the old ape was suddenly awakened. It looked in the direction of the cliff and suddenly found that the collapsed rock bulged slightly, and then a hole broke open. Under the morning light, a person walked out from inside. It was Ping Yonka. The old ape and the other monkeys were extremely shocked at this scene. How could someone who was clearly dead come back to life? The old ape led the monkeys across the stream toward Ping Yonka. However, before they could get close, the look in their eyes changed drastically, and they fled back while shrieking. Ping Yonka was covered in dust and his hair was extremely messy. He looked like a beggar, and his smell was even worse than a beggar's. He covered his nose and looked at the monkeys fleeing in all directions. His eyes were filled with regret. Then, he jumped into the stream. The snowflakes melted as soon as they landed in the stream. The water was extremely cold, but he did not care at all. He carefully scrubbed his body and used the sword fire to get rid of the stubborn dirt from time to time. After who knew how long, he finally felt that his smell was gone. He apologized to the dead fish floating in the stream downstream and walked out. Just as he was about to pick up his clothes and put them on, he smelled the stench again. He could not help but retch. He quickly burned the clothes into smoke as fast as he could. The smoke drifted by the stream. It still carried the stench, just like the lingering fear in his eyes. A year ago, he had swallowed all the pills in the bottle. The powerful medicinal power began to transform his Taoist tree directly. It also cleansed his body while it was at it. All the impurities and filth in his body were forced out by the medicinal power. He farted dozens of times in a row. It was the sound of thunder that the monkeys heard that day. The farts were extremely smelly. However, the formation in the abode isolated them so well that there was no circulation of air at all. Only the circulation of spiritual qi did not leak out at all. Ping Yonka was forced to cultivate in seclusion in such a smelly environment for a year. He almost became the first pitiful person to be suffocated to death by his own farts. As for why he did not become an idiot who ate too many pills and exploded to death, nobody knew. He had no idea about it himself. He thought it was a matter of course. Again, how could something happen to a fortuitous encounter? After some time, the smoke finally dissipated. The old ape led the monkeys to cover their mouths and noses and cautiously approached. Ping Yonka waved his hand at the old ape. He had just finished his closed-door cultivation, so he could not control his sword will well. As he waved his hand, a streak of sword will fell into the stream. The stream suddenly quieted down, and a crack appeared in the stream. Looking from the side, it looked like a transparent jade. It was extremely difficult to cut water with a sword, even for the Aoyama sword practitioners who were good at cutting water. Seeing this, Ping Yonka was taken aback. He looked at the monkeys and asked, "What is my current cultivation state?" After joining Aoyama, he was brought to Shinma Peak by Jingjiu after learning for a short time at the sword-washing pavilion. During the years at Shinma Peak, he had done nothing but learn the endless sword style of Qingrong Peak. He had no experience in fighting with other cultivation practitioners, so it was inevitable that he lacked confidence. The monkeys hesitated for a while, and then clapped their hands one after another, indicating that he could do it. The reason why they hesitated was not because they thought Ping Yonka was not good enough, but because they had to put down the hands covering their mouths and noses when they clapped. Ping Yonka asked awkwardly, "When do you think I can break through the sea state?" The monkeys shook their heads without hesitation this time. Their movements were neat and the scene was quite interesting. Did they mean that he couldn't break through the sea state? Or did he have to cultivate by himself and not think too highly of himself? Ping Yonka was at a loss. Of course, he didn't dare to think that they might mean that he had already broken through the sea state and didn't have to think about when he could break through the sea state. Master said that I can't go out of the mountain before I break through the sea state. How can I go out and find them? He was a bit distressed, but then he thought that he had finally made a breakthrough in his cultivation state, so he felt happy again. He went to the hut in the woods and made himself a cup of green tea. The green tea had been there for a few years, so it was not new. It tasted a bit bitter, but it made him feel refreshed, and he thought of a solution. He took out a light green sword robe from the cupboard and put it on, and then took out a conical hat, heading toward the foot of the peak. After a few years, conical hats were always kept on Shinma Peak. The brim of the conical hat was very wide. As long as one wore it on the head, it would be hard for others to see one's face. As he arrived at the foot of the peak, Ping Yonka went directly to the sword-washing stream. He wanted to find Senior Master Mei Li, whom he knew, and ask her when the plum meeting would begin. If it was held as usual, would he be qualified to participate in the plum meeting and go out of the mountain as long as he won the top 10 at the sword trial? Unexpectedly, he only saw some new disciples sleeping on the tables lazily like he had done before at the sword-washing hall, but didn't see a single master. He grabbed a caretaker and asked, and found out that today was the day of the sword trial in Aoyama, and the participants of the plum meeting would be decided soon. Hearing this answer, Ping Yonka couldn't help but look at the silvery sword-washing stream, lost in thought. In order to improve his cultivation state and avenge his master, the old ape took him to a manor cave and took a bottle of magic pills. He wanted to participate in the plum meeting, but he encountered the sword trial at the foot of the peak. He was so lucky. It seemed that even the legendary Hejan couldn't compare to him. I'll show my longing and resentment for Bean's new book as usual. In addition, in the next 1.5 months, I'll deal with moving house and my family coming to the Northeast for the summer vacation. I'll try my best to update the book, but the number of updates will be small. I'll report them to you in advance. Chapter 597. As usual, the sword trial of Aoyama was held in the sword forest on Tianguang Peak. Ping Yonka didn't have a sword, so he couldn't ride it, so he had to run. A dust dragon left the sword-washing stream along with the grass scraps, and soon arrived at the foot of Tianguang Peak, but he was stopped by someone. The disciple of Tianguang Peak wiped off the grass scraps on his face and spat on the ground. He looked at Ping Yonka and asked angrily, "Which peak are you from?" Ping Yonka didn't respond. A dozen sword strings came out from his fingers, forming a shapeless sword net. The disciple of Tianguang Peak was taken aback and said, "Oh, you are a big sister of Qingrong Peak. Please come in." Tianguang Peak was the main peak of Aoyama, but he was a motherless child now, so he didn't dare offend the other peaks, not to mention that this was a big sister of Qingrong Peak. The whole of Aoyama knew that Peak Master Nan Wang was behind closed doors, but he drank more wine than usual. It was evident that he was in a bad mood for a few years. The sword forest was made up of hundreds of stone pillars, each of which was more than 1,000 feet high and looked like a thin sword, half of which reached into the clouds, full of lethal intent. There were 9 stone platforms on the cliff wall opposite the sword forest, where the elders of the 9 peaks sat. The regular disciples of Aoyama were scattered around the sword forest. Ping Yongkao walked to the back of the big sisters of Qingrong Peak with his head lowered. Not far behind him were the disciples of Shuriwe Peak. If he took a step back, he would be regarded as a disciple of Shuriwe Peak, and if he took a step forward, he would be regarded as a disciple of Qingrong Peak. As for why the disciple of Tianguang Peak and the others mistook him for a woman, it was because he had slept on the Sword Peak for a few years and stayed behind closed doors for a year. He didn't drink a drop of water, so he was thin and small, and he wore a conical hat. He thought he had made a good choice. As he was feeling proud of himself, he suddenly saw a pair of feet in front of him, and a calm and gentle voice rang out, "What are you doing here?" He hadn't heard that voice for many years, but he could easily recognize that it was Senior Master Mei Li of Qingrong Peak. He couldn't help but groan inwardly, thinking, "What are you doing here instead of sitting on the stone platform?" As he was about to say that he was a disciple of Shuriwe Peak, he suddenly heard Mei Li say, "Since you are here, you should take a good look." Having said that, Mei Li left Jingjiu's side, but she didn't go to the high platform. Instead, she stood in front of the disciples of Qingrong Peak. Ping Yongkao was startled, but he didn't think too much about it, because the sword trial competition had already begun. An extremely cold and sharp sword light pierced through the clouds and pursued the flying sword in front of it. The flying sword's power was not weak. Everywhere it passed, there was a burst of thunder, but it could do nothing to the sword light behind it. After brushing past each other several times, the 2 flying swords finally met in the air above the stone forest. There was a cracking sound, as if lightning had struck. The stone pillars in the clouds were illuminated, looking extremely terrifying. A figure fell down from a stone pillar a few miles away, and was caught by a master. The figure spat out fresh blood. It was obvious that he was severely wounded. Big Brother Lei Ilkyung has improved his cultivation state quite fast over the last few years, but he still couldn't withstand one sword swing from his opponent. Look at who his opponent is. He has nurtured his flying sword in a few years. Such a talent. I'm afraid that he will be the leader of Liangwang Peak in the future. Hearing the discussions of the disciples of Aoyama, Ping Yongka learned that the loser was Lei Ilkyung. He remembered this name very well. Gu Qing had explained to him and Yuan Chu the attitudes of the disciples of various peaks of Aoyama toward their master. Lei Ilkyung, Yao Songzhan, and Lin Yingliang were all staunch supporters of their master. Covered in blood, Lei Ilkyung was supported by his younger brothers of the same peak. Looking up at the clouds and fog, his eyes were full of resentment. As the clouds and fog dispersed, a sword light landed at the bottom of the stone forest. Jian Ryun put away his flying sword and walked to the front of Lei Ilkyung. Back then, he was one of the strongest disciples of Liangwang Peak. Over the last few years, he had cultivated diligently on Yunxing Peak. Not only had he repaired the flying sword destroyed by Zhuoruzhui, but he had also recovered from his internal injuries. What's more, he had broken through the state and was now a disciple in the middle state of free travel. Some disciples of Aoyama were even discussing who was stronger, him or Guananshan. Looking at Lei Ilkyung, Jian Ryun asked coldly, "Is it useful to kowtow to him every year?" He was referring to the fact that Lei Ilkyung and other disciples of Aoyama would go to Scenery Garden to kowtow to Jingjiu every year since the second year. Lei Ilkyung knew that he was not as skilled as Jian Ryun, and that arguing with him would only bring disgrace to himself, and would even embarrass Scenery Garden. As such, he wiped the blood off his body in silence, without uttering a word. He didn't speak, but his master was displeased, thinking that Jian Ryun's cultivation state was much higher than his disciples, so why did he attack him so brutally? His master said sternly, "Cultivation is not a matter of time. As long as the sword is in your heart, it will be useful." Shaking his head, Jian Ryun said expressionlessly, "You want to worship the sword devil as the official disciple. That means you have embarked on the evil path. The more you cultivate, the worse it will be for you. What's the use? Do you really believe that there is a born shapeless sword body in this world?" Hearing this, the disciples of Aoyama around the sword forest all fell silent. Ping Yongka lifted his head and slightly lifted his conical hat to take a look at this person. Lei Il-kyung was helped down the mountain. Yao Songshan and those young disciples of Scenery Garden all believed that they were no match for Jian Ryun, remaining silent. Jian Ryun didn't say anything more. He sheathed his sword and walked back to Yunqing Peak. For some reason, he didn't go to the high platform where the disciples of Liangwang Peak were seated. More and more young disciples of Aoyama were inclined to Scenery Garden, but nobody in the 9 peaks of Aoyama had mentioned it, because it might involve a branch of Aoyama, which was something none of the disciples of Aoyama wanted to see. Seeing that Lei Il-kyung and Jian Ryun didn't continue their confrontation, many people, including those elders, felt relieved. Unexpectedly, a proud and aloof voice rang out, "Big Brother Jian is right." A young disciple with an aloof and haughty expression walked onto the field. The crowd knew that his name was Fang Xingwei, a disciple of Shilai Peak. It was said that he was a member of the Fang family, talented in martial arts. Though he had entered the sect not long ago, he had already reached the upper state of the undefeated, and was likely to break through the free travel state. Looking around at the disciples of Aoyama, Fang Xingwei demanded, "The deviant methods won't work. Who wants to challenge me?" Even if he was someone important to Fang Jingtian, it was impossible for him to intimidate all the disciples of Aoyama. Moreover, his words were obviously meant to mock Lei Il-kyung and those disciples who were inclined to Scenery Garden. There was an uproar in the field, and many people were ready to step onto the field. Yao Songshan had thought that he wouldn't step onto the field again since he had participated in the plum meeting, but he couldn't hold himself back after hearing this. Yet, he forgot that Lei Il-kyung had been forced to step onto the field in the same situation. Hearing the discussion of the big sisters of Qingrong Peak, Ping Yongka learned the identity of this person. His gaze toward him became a bit unfriendly. When he came down from Yunqing Peak last year, he had heard a few colleagues talk about what had happened at the grand ceremony of the sect master. He knew that the sect master of Shilai Peak, Fang Jingtian, had already entered the heavenly arrival state, and this person was the main culprit who had imprisoned his master and others on Shinma Peak, expelled them from Aoyama. This person was a disciple of Shilai Peak, and a member of the Fang family, so he of course wanted to beat him up. In addition, he wanted to leave Aoyama in the name of participating in the plum meeting. No matter what, he had to find an opportunity to strike. The problem was, he didn't have a sword, and he hadn't fought before, so he didn't know how to fight. As a result, he felt a bit guilty. As Ping Yongka was hesitating, Yao Songshan and a dozen other disciples had stepped forward, ready to challenge Fang Xingwei. Seeing this, Fang Xingwei wasn't afraid at all. On the contrary, he raised his eyebrows even higher, showing his self-confidence. It was then that Mei Li suddenly said, "Let our Qingrong Peak have this round." Mei Li was an elder of Qingrong Peak, and she had been teaching the new disciples at the Hall of Sword Washing for decades. Like Lin Wuji, she was highly respected by her colleagues. Seeing that she had spoken, Yao Songshan and the others didn't dare challenge her, and stepped back in tandem, feeling a bit surprised. Countless gazes fell on the female disciples of Qingrong Peak on Mei Li's back, trying to guess who would fight next. Mei Li turned to the disciple wearing a conical hat at the back of the crowd, saying, "You. I'll choose you." Ping Yongka was extremely nervous. He had never fought before, let alone fought with a flying sword, and he didn't even have a sword. Standing on the top of the tall stone post and looking at his opponent in the distance, he felt his lips were a bit dry, and his hands were trembling slightly. Seeing that this young sister didn't have a sword in her hand, Fang Xingwei knew that she had entered the undefeated state, but it seemed that she didn't have any fighting experience and was scared. Fang Xingwei couldn't help but feel pity for her, saying, "Young sister, you go first." Ping Yongka thought that he didn't have a damn sword, so how could he go first? He had no choice but to shake his head. Fang Xingwei was a bit surprised, but he didn't think too much about it, saying, "Sorry for the offense." No sooner had he said this than a bright sword light illuminated the thin fog above the stone post. Along with a shrill sound of breaking the air, the flying sword had traveled a distance of more than 1,000 feet in an instant and arrived in front of Ping Yongka, aiming at his conical hat. No matter how much the disciples of Aoyama cared about their demeanor, they wouldn't give in to their opponent in a sword fight, because it was a form of respect for themselves and their opponent. Fang Xingwei did the same. He used the most difficult move to defend against in the seven-plumb sword style, but he chose a more merciful place to strike his sword. The flying sword traveled at a high speed, but its path was unpredictable. On the high platform of Shilai Peak, Fang Jingtian remained silent, but the rest of the elders smiled, feeling satisfied. On the high platform of Yunxing Peak, not far away, Fu Wang even praised Ping Yongka. Ping Yongka didn't have enough time to react. After a moment of bewilderment, he found his opponent's flying sword had arrived in front of him. It was thanks to his experience on Shima Peak that he didn't fall off the stone post in fear. At the time, he had already taken the role of Yuan Chu and stood by the stream, waiting for Zhao Leu to strike the stone while talking to the old Ma. He had seen the blood-red sword light many times. Compared to the thoughtless sword, Fang Xingwei's sword was like a rice-sized pearl, a rice-sized pearl. Yet, Ping Yongka didn't know how to deal with this sword. He had learned the endless sword style a long time ago, but he didn't have a sword. He suddenly remembered a story told by his big brother Guqing, and raised his hands reflexively to grab the flying sword. Seeing this, many people thought that he had lost his composure and forgot to use his sword, so they couldn't help but cry out in surprise, thinking that they would see his hand being cut off and blood dripping down. The big sisters of Qingrong Peak cried out worriedly. Unexpectedly, as Ping Yongka reached out his hands in a seemingly panicked manner, Fang Xingwei's flying sword halted in front of the conical hat, unable to move an inch forward, and even the bright sword light grew dimmer. Everybody sensed the sword wills exuding from Ping Yongka's fingers. "Locking autumn?" An elder of Shilai Peak stood up in surprise and exclaimed while looking at the top of the stone post. Chapter 598. Back at the sword trial of Aoyama, Gu Han had attempted to use the locking autumn technique to block Jingjiu's sword of the universe, but he failed. Did this female disciple of Qingrong Peak also know the locking autumn technique? Countless gazes were fixed on Mei Li. "This is the sword net style of our Qingrong Peak," she said calmly. It was true that many people had discovered that the sword wills coming out from Ping Yongka's fingers were very thin and soft, more like invisible sword strings that were woven together in a complicated way, looking like a net. Regardless of whether Fang Xingwei's flying sword was a winding plum branch or something else, it would be like an insect in a spider's web once it fell into the net. How could it fly away? As the crowd was discussing the matter, Fang Xingwei had also sensed the sticky feeling coming from the flying sword like a swamp. He felt uneasy and knew that he had to take back control of the sword as soon as possible. He had no time to be angry at this young sister for pretending to be pitiful. He summoned his sword source in an attempt to take back the flying sword. Meanwhile, he pressed the middle and index fingers of his right hand together to form a sword instruction, ready to employ the most powerful lethal move of the seven-plumb sword style. It was then that Ping Yonka found that he had actually caught hold of his opponent's flying sword. As he was feeling happy, he suddenly sensed a powerful force coming from the flying sword, and the flying sword started trembling violently, exuding a lethal intent. He was taken aback at first, but then he felt delighted instead of shocked, thinking that he was familiar with this move. He was bored because he couldn't practice sword work when he was at the Shima Peak. Big brother Yuan Chu didn't have a real sword at the time, but he often mocked him instead of sympathizing with him and used the seven-plumb sword style to annoy him. Ping Yonka had seen this sword style dozens of times, even if he hadn't seen it 100 times. The problem was, how could he deal with this lethal sword style? While Ping Yonka was thinking about this, his hands had already started moving instinctively. His fingers moved at a high speed in the thin fog. It seemed to be chaotic and irregular, but he had actually employed more than 10 moves of the endless sword style. Pa, 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 pa. Amidst a series of crisp sounds of impact, the flying sword that was trying to get out of control was hit by Ping Yonka's fingers. It was like a dragonfly in a rainstorm. Every time it wanted to fly, it would be smashed by an incomparably large raindrop. It couldn't leave at all, and in the end, it could only fall down powerlessly. Its transparent wings and thin body disintegrated in the rainstorm, turning into pieces. Just like that, the flying sword actually broke into dozens of pieces, as if someone had used a pair of pliers to cut off iron sheets, and floated towards the bottom of the stone pillar. Fang Xinghuai's flying sword was destroyed, and his sword pellets suffered a backlash. He spat out a mouthful of fresh blood and fell backward. A sword light flashed and caught him. However, no one cared about those flying sword fragments. They fell to the ground and made a series of crisp sounds. Everybody was stunned, including Mei Li. She lifted her head and looked at the thin figure on the stone post, a surprised expression on her face. It was understandable that he had defeated Fang Xinghuai, but how could he know the endless sword style of Qingrong Peak? The female disciples of Qingrong Peak were also surprised. They asked Mei Li who this person was, but Mei Li didn't say anything. Some of them thought the scene in front of them was familiar, but then they remembered that Jing Zhou had broken Guananshan's sword with his own hands many years ago. Guananshan was much more powerful than Fang Xinghuai at the time, but Jing Zhou's hand was bleeding at the time, so he wasn't as casual and indifferent as this female disciple of Qingrong Peak. Someone glanced at Guananshan reflexively. Guananshan looked at the disciple of Qingrong Peak wearing the conical hat, feeling it odd. Of course, a disciple in his cultivation state could tell that this disciple of Qingrong Peak had indeed used the most authentic endless sword style, and he had learned it very well and had a high level of attainment. It was impossible to achieve such a level without decades of hard work. Was this disciple of Qingrong Peak a personal disciple of Senior Master Nan Wang? "Young sister, please come down," said Guananshan in a clear voice. Ping Yonka was still immersed in the bewilderment and joy of winning the first sword fight in his life. He looked at his hands in bewilderment, wondering how powerful Senior Master Zhao's sword work was. The Senior Master Zhao he was thinking of at the moment was not Nan Wang, but Zhao Liu. Back when they were eating hot pot, Zhao Liu and Zhuo Ruzhui discussed the method of entering the sword wills into one's body. He happened to overhear their discussion, which was why he had slept on the sword peak for a few years. Ping Yonka suddenly had an unimaginable courage and self-confidence. He pointed at Jianryun at the bottom of the sword forest and said, "No, I want to challenge you." The surroundings of the sword forest became chaotic. It was not because he had the courage to challenge Jianryun, one of the strongest swordsmen of Liangwang Peak, but because his voice was obviously that of a man. When was the last time a male disciple appeared on Qingrong Peak? An elder of Shilai Peak yelled sternly, "Take off your conical hat and identify yourself." Ping Yongka didn't mind. He took off his conical hat and revealed his face. For most of the disciples of Aoyama, this face was unfamiliar, but some of them had a deep impression of it. Lin Wuji shot a glance at Mei Li. Seeing that Mei Li remained silent, Lin Wuji knew that she had already known that person was Ping Yongka. He couldn't help but smile. Some of them had seen Ping Yongka on the top of Tianguang Peak, so they couldn't help but be shocked speechless. The elder of Shilai Peak yelled with a gloomy expression, "How dare you pretend to be a disciple of Qingrong Peak?" Ping Yongka said innocently, "I've never admitted that I'm a disciple of Qingrong Peak." Seeing Mei Li remain silent, Lin Wuji's smile grew wider. "Who are you then?" he asked. "I'm Ping Yongka, a disciple of Shenma Peak." His line of sight swept over the masters of the peaks and the disciples of Aoyama, and finally fell on Jian Ryun's face. "My master is Jingjiu," he said. Hearing Ping Yongka's words, the surroundings of the sword forest became deathly quiet, devoid of any sound. Many disciples of Aoyama suddenly remembered that there was an inconspicuous disciple of Shenma Peak who had stayed in Aoyama instead of Cloudy Town. Before the elder of Shilai Peak could say anything, the gloomy voice of Elder Shi Mingxian of Yunqing Peak broke out, "In Aoyama, nobody is allowed to mention the name of that sword devil, and you're not qualified to participate in the sword trial." Shi Mingxian was Jian Ryun's master. Though he believed that Jian Ryun was more powerful than Ping Yongka, who had only been in Aoyama for a short time, Ping Yongka was obviously a bit strange, and he was the personal disciple of Jingjiu, so Shi Mingxian had to stop this sword fight. Ping Yongka didn't pay any attention to this person, and stared into Jian Ryun's eyes. In fact, many people were well aware that this sword fight was inevitable after Ping Yongka mentioned his master, Jingjiu. Jian Ryun's expression remained unchanged. He called out his flying sword and stepped on it. A few moments later, he arrived in the sky, his clothes tousling in the wind like a large bird. "Even though you've learned the endless sword style of Qingrong Peak, you're still no match for me, because you can't see my sword." Jian Ryun said this expressionlessly while looking at Ping Yongka, as if he were looking at a dead man. Yunqing Peak used the old bird sword style, which emphasized the birds flying in the sky and the shadows of the clouds. The sword style was extremely agile, resembling the magic methods of the mysterious sects, or even the escape method of heaven and earth of the Zhongzhou school. If Ping Yongka couldn't even capture the true trajectory of his flying sword, how could he trap his sword like he did when he defeated Fang Xingwei? Jian Ryun waved his sleeve lightly. A flying sword flew out from his sleeve. His movement seemed casual, but the flying sword arrived in front of Ping Yongka in the blink of an eye. It was many times faster than Fang Xingwei's flying sword. "It's too fast." As this thought occurred to Ping Yongka, Jian Ryun's flying sword hadn't flown out from his sleeve yet. To put it more precisely, Jian Ryun's shoulder had just moved a little, and Jingjiu had the idea that his opponent's sword was too fast. Faced with such a fast flying sword, Jingjiu wasn't confident that he could trap his opponent with the endless sword style. As such, he had only two choices left: to intercept it with his flying sword or to evade it. It was because he didn't have a sword, so he had only one choice. The problem was that his opponent's flying sword was so fast that it was impossible for him to evade it in time. As Ping Yongka was pondering this question, his body had already reacted in advance. He lifted his right foot and stomped heavily on the surface of the stone pillar. Crack! A crack appeared on the top of the stone pillar, the crushed stones falling down from it. With the powerful counterforce, Jian Ryun flew up into the sky, disappearing without a trace in an instant. Nobody noticed that before he disappeared, dozens of extremely faint sword lights drifted out of his collar, his sleeves, the soles of his shoes, and his hair. Jian Ryun was taken aback, thinking that Ping Yongka had employed the escape method of sword. "You're courting death," he exclaimed icily with raised brows. No matter how excellent the escape method of sword was, it couldn't evade the eyes of the old bird. More importantly, it couldn't be faster than a real flying sword. Jian Ruyun rolled up his sleeve slightly, and the flying sword flew back to him. He stepped onto the flying sword and chased up into the sky. The sword lights shone brightly all of a sudden. The thin fog enshrouded the stone forest, but it couldn't block the sword lights. The disciples of Aoyama cried out in surprise. This wasn't riding a sword, but a real sword raining. Only a sword practitioner who had mastered the true meaning of the sword work could exert the power of the old bird sword style to the fullest by raining the sword. Nobody had expected that Jian Ruyun had improved his sword work to such an extent after a few years of inactivity. The old bird sword style emphasized on striking once and killing once the sword was unsheathed. Based on the prowess displayed by Jian Ruyun, Ping Yongka would probably be severely wounded or even killed. Many people had thought of this possibility. Guananshan was very worried. He wanted to stop this sword fight, but he found that neither Elder Qi Yan of the Shangda Peak nor Elder Shi Mingxian said anything, nor did they move. They were staring at the clouds in the sky with grave expressions on their faces. Chapter 599. As the thin fog grew thicker, the ordinary disciples of Aoyama couldn't see what was happening in the high sky anymore. They could only vaguely see that the sword light was moving upward. All of a sudden, a series of sword sounds rang out in the high sky. By the time the sounds reached the ground, they were already very faint, like a gentle spring rain. The people thought that Jian Ruyun had seen through Ping Yongka's escape art and was launching a series of attacks at him. Hearing the sword sounds, the crowd was stunned, wondering how high Jian Ruyun's cultivation state was since he could strike so many sword moves in such a short time. The clouds and fog suddenly dispersed a bit, revealing a passage. Ping Yongka dropped down from the high sky and landed on the stone pillar where he had been standing. His fall was so violent that he couldn't stand firmly on his legs. His left knee went soft, and he knelt down, smashing heavily on the surface of the stone pillar. A cracking sound was heard again. More gravel fell from the damaged stone pillar, and it started to sway. It was extremely likely that it would collapse. Seeing this, the disciples of Aoyama cried out in surprise again. Lei Ilkyung, Yao Songshan, and the others thought excitedly that he was indeed the personal disciple of the senior grandmaster. He didn't die in such a situation. But where was Jian Ruyun? Why hadn't he shown up yet? It was evident that Ping Yongka didn't have the strength to fight anymore, and he could win the battle without killing him. Was it because he wasn't satisfied? As the crowd was thinking about this, the clouds and fog dispersed again, revealing a passage, and a dark shadow fell down from the high sky. "Save him!" Guananshan yelled with a slightly changed expression. Before he could say anything, the elder of Yunxing Peak, Shi Mingxian, had already flown off the platform and arrived at the foot of the stone pillar at a high speed, catching Jian Ruyun by a hair's breadth. Jian Ruyun was unconscious, and his body was covered with sword wounds, blood seeping out incessantly. It was evident that he was severely wounded. There was an uproar in the crowd. Everybody fixed their gazes on Ping Yongka, who was still kneeling on the top of the stone pillar, wondering in astonishment if he had won the sword fight in the high sky. Even Mary and Lin Wuji revealed expressions of disbelief. Jian Ruyun was a real swordsman on Liangwang Peak, and he was almost as powerful as Guananshan. How could he be defeated by a disciple who had only been here for 10 years? Ping Yongka stood up with difficulty. Before he could say anything, he spat out a mouthful of blood, causing another round of exclamations. However, everyone could tell that his injury was much lighter than Jian Ruyun's. A breeze was blowing from the top of Tianguang Peak, ruffling the sea of clouds and his clothes. Many people noticed that dozens of sword lights were being absorbed into his body along with the breeze. What kind of sword technique was this? Many Aoyama disciples were lost in their thoughts. The elders of various peaks who had participated in the sword trial of Aoyama had different expressions on their faces. Some of them looked grave, and some of them looked gratified. Ping Yonka lifted his sleeve to wipe off the blood on his face. He took a look at Jianryun, who was in a coma, and then looked at the high platform on Shilai Peak and the figure in the heavenly arrival state with fluttering silver eyebrows. He asked calmly but provocatively, "This is the born shapeless sword body. Do you understand it?" After Jianryun wounded Lei Ilkyung on purpose, he said, "Do you really think there is such a thing as the born shapeless sword body in this world?" Those who thought Jingjiu was a sword devil all thought so. Jingjiu could achieve those unimaginable things only because he was a sword. Unexpectedly, it didn't take long for Ping Yonka to wound Jianryun. According to him, he had used the shapeless sword body. Even he had learned the shapeless sword body. Why couldn't his master Jingjiu have learned it? Are you going to say that Ping Yonka is also a sword devil? But there is only one all-in-one sword in the world. Shi Mingxuan's furious shout came from the foot of the sword woods, "Take down this devil man." Jianryun was wounded severely, and it was obvious that some of his meridians had been cut off. It was hard to say whether he could continue his cultivation. As Jianryun's master, Shi Mingxian was so furious that he wished he could kill Ping Yonka on the spot. However, the response to this elder of Yunqing Peak was a stretch of silence. Nobody responded to him, and nobody took down Ping Yonka as he had requested. Nobody even cast a glance at him. The atmosphere at the foot of Tianguang Peak was quite weird at the moment. Everybody's gazes were fixed on a high platform among the cliff. It was the place where Ping Yonka was looking at when he said that. Fang Jingtian was sitting there. Guang Yuan, Jinren, Qi Yan, Mo Qi, and the others were looking at him in silence. You said that Jingjiu is a sword devil, but how do you explain what has happened today? Mei Li led Ping Yonka to Cloudy Town. She didn't go to Scenery Garden right away. Instead, she took him on a stroll in the town. Have you found anything wrong? She asked softly. Looking at the people in the restaurants and tea-houses, Ping Yonka remarked with furrowed brows, "There are so many cultivation practitioners." Mei Li said with a smile, "They all want to meet the immortal Jingyang. Though they were driven away once, who would really give up? The cultivation practitioners live a long life, and a few decades are nothing to them. Maybe they think this is a test for them by the immortal." Ping Yonka said, "I know you're trying to persuade me to think it over. But don't worry, I won't act recklessly." In fact, what he was thinking was that Fang Jingtian had already reached the heavenly arrival state. Even if he didn't give an explanation to the Shinma Peak, what could he do? He suddenly thought of something and asked, "Senior Master, why are you so sure that my master is the immortal Jingyang?" Mei Li had taught in the Hall of Sword Washing for decades. The disciples of Aoyama were used to calling her senior master Mei Li, but it wasn't an accurate order. Hearing Ping Yonka's question, she smiled but didn't explain. After the grand ceremony of the sect master, Nan Wang disappeared for a day and started drinking as soon as he came back. He was drunk to this day. Mei Li couldn't figure out what had happened. Not many people knew that Nan Wang liked the immortal Jingyang, and she happened to be one of them. After leaving Cloudy Town and arriving before the thick fog, Mei Li said, "Your master and the others have been living here these years." Having said that, she left on her sword. She believed that the immortal Jingyang was living in Scenery Garden, but she couldn't stay here because of Nan Wang, nor could she go in. Ping Yonka bowed to the sword light heading toward the peaks of Aoyama with a solemn expression. When he straightened his body, he suddenly changed into a different person. He rushed toward the thick fog and shouted excitedly, "Master! Senior Master! Senior Brothers! I'm coming!" The cultivation practitioners in Cloudy Town had already noticed his and Mei Li's movements, so they had been staring at them. Seeing him rushing into the fog, they couldn't help but sneer. wondering where this idiot came from. Wasn't he courting death? But in the next moment, the sneers on their lips froze, because that person had really rushed into the fog. Ping Yongka didn't know that the thick fog was a formation. Even if he knew, he wouldn't care. Would his master stop him outside if he knew it was him? With this thought in mind, he rushed into the fog and arrived in front of the gate of Scenery Garden. Seeing the large courtyard in front of him, he was taken aback. He straightened his clothes, walked up the stone steps, pushed open the tightly closed gate, and walked into the courtyard, but he didn't see anyone. There was no one under the flowering trees, by the stream, or under the roofed corridor. Ping Yongka's face was a bit pale. He searched Scenery Garden a few times as quickly as he could, but he didn't find anyone or a cat here, nor could he hear cold cicada. Looking at the empty courtyard, he felt quite regretful. He raised his right hand and slapped his own face slightly, saying, "You're really an idiot. If you had restrained your temper and listened to the others, you would have known that my master and the others had already left Aoyama. Why did you have to stay in the mountains? Maybe you should have learned from Big Brother Guqing how to talk like a monkey." In the next moment, Jingju recalled that his master had told him that he couldn't leave the mountains until he broke the sea-breaking state. Feeling a bit better, he continued while rubbing his slightly painful cheek. "But you couldn't leave Aoyama if my master didn't come to pick you up, right? It's a good thing that you can leave the mountains on your own. And you've done a great job." Thinking that he had defeated that person on the Shilai Peak and Jianryun in the sword trial of Aoyama, Jingju let out a silly smile. He was finally in the mood to enjoy the scenery in Scenery Garden. The flowering trees were still blooming without being taken care of, the koi fish were swimming freely in the stream without being watched. Thinking that Big Brother Guqing and the others had been watching these flowering trees and the stream in the last few years, the smile on Ping Yongka's face grew even more silly. In the next moment, he noticed 6 faint marks on the floor under the roofed corridor. He guessed that the marks were made by the legs of the bamboo chair. Rolling his eyes, he sat on the chair gingerly and moved his buttocks, revealing a satisfied smile. As the sunlight shifted, the scenery in Scenery Garden changed accordingly. The smile on Jingju's face gradually disappeared, leaving only a sad expression. "Where have you guys been?" Chapter 600. Ping Yongka didn't stay in Scenery Garden for too long. He came out of Aoyama in the name of participating in the plum meeting, so he had to participate in the plum meeting anyway. Besides, his master's home was in Zhaoga City. Thinking of all this, he left the patch of thick fog and returned to Cloudy Town. Under the shocked and envious gazes of those cultivation practitioners, he found an inconspicuous business. Guqing had told Yuan Chu and Ping Yongka many things back at Shinma Peak, such as the situation in the cultivation circle, the enemies and friends of Shinma Peak, and some important information that he should remember, such as this business belonged to the Gu clan, and he could ask them to do something for him. "I'm Ping Yongka," he said to the owner of the business. "Have you heard of me?" Yuan Chu and Jingju might not remember the things Guqing told them, but everyone in the Gu clan would know the names, appearances, and habits of all the people on Shinma Peak by heart. The owner of the business bowed respectfully, saying, "Immortal Master, please tell me what to do." Yuan Chu asked, "Do you know where my big brother has gone?" What had happened at the sword trial of Aoyama hadn't been spread out in the cultivation circle, but it couldn't be concealed from the members of the Gu clan. The owner of the business knew that this immortal master had stayed behind closed doors in Aoyama for many years, so he didn't know what had happened afterward. "We haven't received any news about him either," he said. "But Scenery Garden hasn't ordered hot pot since about 20 days ago." Yuan Chu thought he had only left for about 20 days. After some thought, he said, "I want to go to Zhaoga City." The owner of the business was taken aback, thinking that he could fly then. Suddenly, he thought of Jingjiu, and realized that this pair of master and disciple had the same quirk. He led Yuan Chu to the courtyard behind the trading company, pointed at the carriage that had not been used for many years but was still brand new, and said respectfully, "This was sect master's favorite carriage in the past." Ping Yongka leaned on the couch and looked at the scenery through the skylight. He ate the freshest fruits of the season and felt that his master really knew how to enjoy life. The clouds in the skylight suddenly darkened. He narrowed his eyes and found that it was the shadow of a huge object. He asked, "Is there something ahead?" The coachman replied respectfully, "Zhaoga City is up ahead." Recently, the security in Zhaoga City was very tight. The flying carriages had not landed in the sky, and all the carriages entering and exiting the city gate had to undergo a rigorous search. The horse-drawn carriage of the Gu clan wasn't inspected at all. It passed through the long queue and entered Zhaoga City easily. It didn't mean that the Gu clan was so powerful. It was because the Gu clan had made arrangements in advance and informed the relevant authorities in Zhaoga City of who was sitting in the carriage. Of course, an ordinary third-generation disciple of Aoyama would not have that much respect. However, if that person was perfected Jingyang's closed-door disciple, then it would be a different story. The horse-drawn carriage didn't stop after entering Zhaoga City. It continued traveling westward until it arrived in front of a cluster of mountains. This cluster of mountains extended endlessly, but it was still within the boundaries of Zhaoga City. It was evident how large Zhaoga City was. Ping Yongka got off the carriage and nodded to the coachman, heading toward the inside of the mountains along the green stone-paved mountain path. Like Aoyama and Cloud Dream Mountain, these mountains were enshrouded by the fog all year long, so mortals couldn't even see their faces. Ping Yongka was stopped by an official of the Pure Heaven Bureau before he walked far, and then brought to a house behind the mountain. The leader of the Aoyama sect to participate in the plum meeting this year was the peak master of Yunxing, Fu Wang. He was surprised to see Ping Yongka, asking, "What are you doing here?" "To participate in the plum meeting, of course," said Ping Yongka, feeling baffled. Fu Wang asked with raised eyebrows, "What qualification do you have to participate in the plum meeting?" "It's because I won against Big Brother Jianryun," said Ping Yongka. I won. The last two you won were not the echoes of the mountains, but Jingjiu himself." The expression on Fu Wang's face grew unsightly. Thinking of the decision he made before he left Aoyama, he suppressed his anger and waved his hand to signal for Jingjiu to take a rest. This year's plum meeting was no different from the previous years, consisting of zither, chess, calligraphy, painting and cultivation. The performance of the Aoyama sect was similar to that of the previous years. They didn't register for the first 4 competitions, and were merely spectators. The cultivation practitioners of various sects stood on the stone platforms reaching into the clouds, and the blooming plum blossoms decorated the scenery like the stars in the sky. The zither music was very melodious, and the calligraphy and painting seemed to be beautiful, but they couldn't attract Ping Yongka's attention. It wasn't until more than 10 days later, when the cultivation practitioners of various sects gathered on the chessboard mountain to prepare for the chess tournament, that he finally found the person he was looking for. Cain Yang of the Mirror sect hadn't participated in the chess tournament of the plum meeting for a long time, and it was no exception this year. But she was invited by the imperial court as a referee to participate in the tournament. Early in the morning, she strolled casually on the mountain, observing the arrangements of the go boards in the pavilions in the rain and by the streams, in order to ensure the fairness of the games. Looking at the familiar sceneries, she recalled the first time she participated in the plum meeting and the shocking fight between her teacher and the young master Tong Yen. She couldn't help but let out a faint smile. It was then that she suddenly heard a voice coming from the forest in front of her. "Over here! Over here!" She turned around and saw a strange young man standing behind a big tree. She couldn't help but be taken aback. The young man jumped out from behind the tree, and said while waving his hand, "Big sister, I'm Ping Yongka." Cain Yang didn't remember until she heard this name, and the way he addressed her as big sister. "Are you Ping Ping? Why are you here?" Ping Yonka said, "My master and the others are missing. I came to Zhaoga City to look for them." Cain Yang was somewhat startled, asking, "Aren't teacher and the others in Scenery Garden outside Cloudy Town?" Ping Yonka said, "There is no one in Scenery Garden now." Upon hearing this, Cain Yang couldn't help but feel nervous. She led Ping Yonka down the chessboard mountain, leaving the chess tournament behind. In Zhaoga City, they went to the Jing House and the Zhao Garden, but they didn't find anything, nor did they find any clues. Cain Yang grew more nervous, but she didn't dare to tell the masters of her sect about it. After all, Jing Jiu's identity was too special. If this matter was spread out, no one could tell what kind of disturbance it would cause. The law tournament is about to begin. Go to White Town first. Take care of yourself and come back safely. She patted Ping Yonka's head and said, "Now it's just the two of us. Leave the things here to me. Don't worry too much." Ping Yonka was touched and said, "Senior sister, I won't embarrass you." The young cultivation practitioners participating in the cultivation tournament of the Plum Meeting went to White Town. They would repeat what their predecessors had done in that land of ice and snow. They might encounter dangers, and they might encounter new opportunities, and they might learn about the ugliness and kindness of human nature. But they had to learn about life and death first. Under the roofed corridor of the West Mountain Immortal House, dozens of paintings were displayed again. The bare plum branches in the paintings were waiting to be dyed red with bloody plum blossoms. Nobody expected that the cultivation tournament of the Plum Meeting would end so soon, even faster than the one held by Jingjiu. 3 days after the cultivation tournament began, the plum branches in one of the paintings were full of blossoms. The thickly dotted red plum blossoms almost occupied the whole painting. Though the number of red plum blossoms was less than that of Jingjiu, it was the second highest in the history of the Plum Meeting, meaning that he would win first place in the cultivation tournament. This painting of bloody plum blossoms belonged to Ping Yonka. A few days later, Ping Yonka returned to the West Mountain Immortal House in Zhaoga City under the astonished gazes of many people. It wasn't until now that his true identity was known by the crowd. Thinking that he was the personal disciple of Jingjiu, the astonishment became understandable. On the same night, Ping Yonka and Cain Yang met on the chessboard mountain. Hearing the footsteps behind her, Cain Yang pulled back her gaze from Zhaoga City and turned to Jingjiu, shaking her head apologetically. Ping Yonka asked confusedly, "Why did they leave Scenery Garden? Was it because they were threatened? But where is the safest place in this world than Aoyama?" Cain Yang comforted him. "Maybe we are overthinking it. My teacher is a casual immortal, so he might take us out for a stroll." Ping Yonka shook his head and said, "My master is not casual, he's lazy. He wouldn't want to go out for no reason." Cain Yang said, "If something happened, how could we find my teacher? You'd better go back to Aoyama and wait. My teacher might come back tomorrow." Ping Yonka nodded as he thought it was the only way. Cain Yang asked, "Your plum flower painting has been taken to the royal palace by the emperor. Are you going to the royal palace to meet the emperor tomorrow?" Ping Yonka had heard from his big brother Gu Qing that his master's plum flower painting was still kept in the royal palace. He would be happy to have his plum flower painting collected by the emperor. "I'll thank the emperor sincerely," he said. He had heard from his big brother Gu Qing that the emperor and his master had a good relationship, so much so that they could trust each other completely. They regarded each other as one of their own, just like Zen master. Seeing his excited expression, Cain Yang reminded him, "You'd better be careful when you enter the royal palace. Zhaoga City is not peaceful these days." The word peaceful was a taboo for all the disciples of Aoyama. Especially now that Ping Yonka knew that his master was the immortal Jingyang, he was even more sensitive. "Don't worry, big sister," he said. After the two of them parted ways, Cain Yang didn't go back to the immortal residence of the Mirror sect. Instead, she went down the mountain and went to Zhaoga City. She asked Ping Yongka to go back to Oyama after the plum meeting because she was worried about his safety. But she had to keep on investigating. If she couldn't find out what had happened to her teacher, how could she feel at ease? She was about to go to the Jing house again. When she was not far from Taichung Temple, she saw a short and fat figure disappearing into a patch of golden light. Chapter 601. Ping Yongka had no idea that Cain Yang was missing. He left the West Mountain Immortal House the next day and was brought to the royal palace by the officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau, and then brought in by an old eunuch. If he were a regular official, he would feel nervous when he entered the royal palace to meet the emperor, but he was a disciple of Aoyama who had won first place in the cultivation tournament of the plum meeting, so he was treated with respect. Thinking that he wouldn't embarrass his master, he pretended to be indifferent. The royal palace was indeed very large. It took him a long time to walk across the square in front of the grand hall. Ping Yongka felt impatient, thinking that it would only take him a few seconds to walk across the square if he ran. As he was complaining about the rules of the mortal world, he suddenly saw the vague godly crossbows behind the palace walls, feeling startled. The godly crossbows were engraved with the amulets carved by the masters of Yamatsai, so they were extremely powerful, even as powerful as the flying swords. If they were shot together, even a powerful cultivation practitioner would be shot to death. However, the royal palace was a place where the rules were the most important. How could such powerful godly crossbows be placed in the royal palace? In the next moment, he sensed that the atmosphere in the royal palace was indeed out of place. Like what Cain Yang had warned him last night, the palace was heavily guarded, but he had no idea what was going on. In the grand hall, Ping Yongka had finally met the emperor. The emperor looked normal, with a mild expression on his face, and he chose his words carefully when praising him. In fact, it was because he didn't know what the emperor had looked like before. Otherwise, he would have noticed that the white hair on the emperor's temples was much longer than before. Likewise, he didn't notice the sadness in the eyes of royal concubine Hu and Crown Prince Jing Yao, who were by the emperor's side. What had happened at the cultivation tournament of the plum meeting was nothing worth mentioning. All Ping Yongka did was kill the monsters and finish his speech in a few sentences. Then, he didn't know what else to say. He looked at the emperor helplessly, thinking that he should be let go as soon as possible. Seeing him behaving like this, the emperor couldn't help but laugh. He waved his hand to let Ping Yongka go, and then said to royal concubine Hu, "As I said back then, the devils are more interesting than the humans." Royal concubine Hu was startled, thinking that this was the private conversation between the two of them back then. Interesting. How dare he say such words in front of a child? Her face reddened in an instant, and she pinched the emperor god imperceptibly. However, her sadness had subsided significantly. Ping Yongka walked out of the palace and soon discovered a problem. The old eunuch who had led him into the imperial palace had disappeared without him noticing. Furthermore, this was clearly not the path to the imperial palace. He could only see the shadows of the towering ancient trees. The flowers and trees in the garden were not messy at all. There was a kind of beauty in their arrangement, like some kind of formation. He looked around vigilantly and secretly mobilized his sword essence, ready to execute the endless sword art at any time. At this moment, a short and fat man slowly walked out from behind a towering ancient tree. It was the height of spring, and the weather was quite warm, but this short and fat man still wore a large cloak. It was unknown why he didn't mind the heat. A gust of wind blew from the palace walls and passed through the flowering trees. It brought with it a faint fragrance and lifted a corner of his cloak, revealing a golden glow. Ping Yongka squinted his eyes, his fingers trembling behind his back. It was a sign that he was about to draw his sword, but it was also a sign of fear. The short and fat man's cultivation state was unfathomable, many times higher than Jian Ryun's. Jingjiu didn't have the slightest confidence that he could defeat him, and he couldn't even escape from him. I don't want to commit suicide, but if you want to attack me, I have no choice but to die. Staring at the short and fat man, Ping Yongka continued in a trembling voice, I'm just a nobody, but my master is the immortal Jingyang. You should know what it means to kill me. The short and fat man laughed. For some reason, he retreated behind the tree and vanished. Looking at the towering ancient tree, Ping Yongka was bewildered for a long time. He didn't believe that the man would leave because of his threat. As time went by, the short and fat man didn't show up. Jingjiu finally believed that everything was over, and he couldn't help but feel relieved. Sweat gushed out from his body, wetting his sword robe. That short and fat man was indeed formidable. Jingjiu felt that he had never been so close to death. It was then that a voice burst out behind him. If he really killed you, what do you think I would do for you? Ping Yongka turned his head and saw a man in white standing in the middle of the flowering trees. The spring wind was blowing gently, and his white robe was fluttering. The man's appearance stole the color of all the flowering trees. Ping Yongka felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He came back to his senses after a while, dashing toward the flowering trees. He knelt down in front of the man in white, hugging his thigh and crying. The man in white was none other than the missing Jingjiu. Seeing Ping Yongka crying bitterly, Jingjiu furrowed his brows slightly and asked, Why are you crying? Thinking of the loneliness on the Shinma Peak, in Scenery Garden, in the carriage of the Gu clan, and in the snowland, Ping Yongka felt extremely sad. Master, our horse died, he said while sobbing. Yuan Chu walked back from the stone door of the manor cave. He took the bowl of water handed to him by Gu Qing and drank a mouthful. Then he looked at the remaining half-bowl of water and said, I wonder how youngest brother will react when he wakes up on Yunxing Peak and finds that we are no longer in Aoyama. Zhuoruzhui was lying on the stone bed with his legs crossed, dozing off with his eyes closed. It will be interesting if he goes to Cloudy Town and finds that we are not in Scenery Garden, he said. Gu Qing didn't say anything. His expression was solemn. It was unclear whether he was worried about Ping Yongka or something else. This was a quiet manor cave. It was spacious inside, with a stone bed, a mountain spring, and a stone table. The person by the stone table turned his head around, his eyebrows full of bewilderment and bewilderment. Did you say that it was confirmed a few years ago that he was the immortal Jingyang? He asked Gu Qing. If he was Tong Yen, then this place must be the manor cave in the Hermit Peak of Aoyama. But he didn't know why Gu Qing, Zhuoruzhui, and the others would leave Scenery Garden and show up here. Gu Qing didn't pay any attention to Tong Yen, asking, What does my master intend to do by locking us up here? Zhuoruzhui said, Can the Gu clan send the hot pot here? Yuan Chu said, When do you think youngest brother will wake up and find that we are not here? Tong Yen said, Is he really the immortal Jingyang? Then many questions can be answered. Everyone was talking about themselves, ignoring the others, because they were all very nervous. On the night dozens of days ago, Jingjiu watched the starry sky for a whole night. Then he suddenly said that he wanted to go back to Aoyama. He led Gu Qing and the others back to Aoyama without attracting anyone's attention. They came to the Hermit Peak through the Sword Jail and entered the manor cave where Tong Yen stayed and then left. Gu Qing and the others became prisoners in the Hermit Peak. Some messy footsteps came from the depths of the manor cave. Zhao Leia walked out. Her short hair and clothes were covered with dirt, and so was the thoughtless sword in her hand that was gripped tightly. She stared at the closed stone door of the manor cave and said expressionlessly, For so many years, I listened to you and refrained from causing any trouble because you said that it's good to be alive. But what are you doing now? Everyone knew that she was talking to Jingjiu, and they all knew that Jingjiu was going to do something important, so he locked them up in the Hermit Peak of Aoyama. In Jingjiu's eyes, the Hermit Peak of Aoyama was the safest place in the world. But what was it that Jingjiu was going to do that even he didn't know? It was obvious that it was a very important and dangerous matter. Gu Qing walked up to Zhao Lei, handed her a handkerchief, and asked with his eyes. Zhao Lei shook her head, indicating that there was also a strong formation in the cliff outside the manor cave, and the thoughtless sword couldn't break it. They had tried many times to break the stone door of the manor cave, but neither Zhuoruzhui's inherited heaven sword nor Tong Yan's Zhongzhou school's Taoist magic skills worked, because the formation outside the manor cave was set up by Jingjiu himself. Is he really the immortal Jingyang? Tong Yan muttered to himself, as if he had encountered the most inexplicable thing in the world. Zhuoruzhui opened his eyes and glanced at him from the corner of his eyes, saying with a mocking tone, "I say, stop talking. Can't you talk about something else?" Tong Yen asked with a smile, "Like what?" Zhao Lei turned around and said while staring into his eyes, "Like what is he going to do? It's simple. Even if something happened in Aoyama and Taiping Jinren came back, he doesn't have to be so vigilant. Nothing serious will happen in the Guoqing Temple. As for White Town, you guys know that he probably won't go there again." Tong Yen said, "Then there is only one possibility. He is going to confront Cloud Dream Mountain." It became quiet in the manor cave again. The Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school had confronted each other for many years, but Jingjiu had been expelled from Aoyama, Zhaoga City. Zhao Lei said after a moment of silence, "The emperor is going to die." No sooner had she said this than the stone door of the manor cave suddenly opened, startling Yuan Chu. Zhuoruzhui, who was lying on the stone bed with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes. He turned into a flash of sword light and was about to dash out of the manor cave. Zhao Lei's reaction and speed were not slower than his. As the blood-red sword light illuminated the stone wall, she had already arrived outside the manor cave. "Pa! Pa!" Zhao Lei and Zhuoruzhui were knocked back and landed on the ground. Soon after, another person landed on the ground. Who was outside the manor cave? Zhao Lei and Zhuoruzhui were both in the upper state of the free travel, but they had no way to fight back. The stone door of the manor cave was closed slowly. The group could vaguely see a large black shadow gliding past. "The Master Night Howler?" Yuan Chu yelled in surprise. Hearing this, Zhao Lei's face grew paler, and Gu Qing felt hopeless. If the dead dog, the principal guard of Aoyama, was watching them in person, how could they escape? "How come you are here?" Looking at the person who was thrown in, Tong Yen furrowed her eyebrows, thinking there were too many things that she couldn't understand lately. That person was Cain Yang. Looking at the people in the manor cave, she also felt bewildered. "I was looking for you in Zhaoga City, and then I met a short and fat swordsman who could emit golden light," she said. Chapter 602. Tong Yen said, "He is Master Jin Mingqing of the Royal Palace." Cain Yang continued, "I was subdued by him and brought here. By the way, where is this place? Why are you two here? Where is my teacher?" Zhao Lei and Gu Qing eyed each other, knowing that they had all guessed correctly. Tong Yen asked Cain Yang, "Tell me about the current situation in Zhaoga City." Cain Yang had calmed down by now. She knew that something was amiss, saying, "It looks peaceful, but there is an undercurrent. It seems that something significant is going to happen." Tong Yen said to Zhao Lei, "It looks like your prediction is correct. The emperor is leaving." After a moment of silence, Zhao Lei asked, "Who will go to the Zhongzhou school?" She was not asking about the famous elders like the immortals Tan and Bai and Yu Qianmen, but about those hidden swordsmen on the back mountain of Cloud Dream Mountain. "Those old people won't strike," Tong Yen said a moment later, "except for a vicious person named Ko Qingtong. I hope he won't show up in Zhaoga City." Yuan Chu said, "Even if the Zhongzhou school is going to compete for the throne, why is the senior master so cautious that he locked us up in advance?" Tong Yen said, It's because he is fully aware that the Zhongzhou school won't play any tricks this time. They will fight against the Aoyama sect fair and square, and the situation will be very dangerous. Yuan Chu was unconvinced, exclaiming, "Is our Aoyama sect inferior to the Zhongzhou school? Whose side are you on?" Tong Yen said, "Before this, I thought that the Aoyama sect would lose for sure." It grew quieter in the manor cave, because they knew what he said was the truth. If the Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school had a head-on fight, their top fighting force would be insufficient. The departure of the immortal Lu Ci couldn't make up for it. Yet, it was obvious that Tong Yen had more to say. But it seems that Taiping Jinren is still alive. Tong Yen pushed the chess pieces on the chessboard aside and said, "Now that we know he is Jinren Jingyang, it's hard to say who will win or lose." Cain Yang walked to the opposite side of him and picked up a black go piece. She placed it on the board in a seemingly casual manner but in fact very solemn. In the royal palace of Zhaoga City, Ping Yongka was walking with Jingjiu. It was rare for him to be so close to his master for such a long period of time. Especially when he saw the tear stains on his master's white robes, he was even more nervous. He often walked with one hand and one leg at the same time. Passing through the flowering trees and several ponds, he arrived at a quiet palace. Jingjiu lifted the lapel of his white robe and sat down on a chair. Receiving Jingjiu's signal from his eyes, Ping Yongka sat down on the right side of the chair in a seemingly casual manner but in fact very solemn. The people on the Shinma Peak all respected Jingjiu a lot, but in terms of intimacy, apart from Zhao Leiyu, Ping Yongka felt the closest, though he had the least contact with Jingjiu. He was merely a regular disciple of the Hall of Sword Washing back then. If he hadn't been selected by Jingjiu to go to the Shinma Peak, he wouldn't have had the fortune he had today. Because of this, he would be grateful to Jingjiu for the rest of his life. The plum meeting is over. You should go back to Aoyama after sitting here for a while, said Jingjiu. Ping Yongka had spent a great deal of effort to find his master, so he didn't want to leave so easily. Moreover, he realized that his master must have something important to do since he was hiding in the royal palace. As a disciple, how could he leave now? Hearing what Jingjiu said, Ping Yongka shook his head like a cicada in winter. Jingjiu glanced at him and said, "Your big brothers have all left. Why do you stay here?" Ping Yongka said, "My big brothers won't leave. There must be some other reason." "Don't leave if you don't want to," said Jingjiu. It was quite troublesome to convince these children. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tricked Zhao Leiyu and the others into going to the hermit peaks of Aoyama. Yet, he hadn't predicted that Ping Yongka would wake up on the Sword Peak, go to the Shinma Peak to take that magic pill, participate in the sword trial, and come to Zhaoga City. Everything in the world had its own reason. Now that Ping Yongka had woken up and come here, there must be a reason for him to come here. Ping Yongka was delighted that his master agreed to let him stay, but he didn't expect to hear something else. Something trivial will happen in a few days. When I ask you to run, you have to run back to Aoyama and tell Tong Yen what you have seen. He will make arrangements for you in the future. Hearing what Jingjiu said, Ping Yongka felt a strong sense of pressure and uneasiness. Before he could say anything, a voice drifted out from the back of the hall. "What about me, teacher?" A little girl drifted out along with the voice. The little girl wore a blue dress, her eyes and brows as beautiful as a painting. The black hair on her forehead was like a leaf, tied into a small braid. She looked very adorable, if one didn't notice that her feet were 1 foot above the ground. Ping Yongka was startled. He pointed at her feet and yelled in a trembling voice, "Ghost, ghost, ghost!" Apiao glanced at him contemptuously and ignored him. She held Jingjiu's sleeve and implored bitterly, "Teacher, you've sent all my big brothers away. Why do you have to leave me here? Can't you ask him to take me and run away? I'm so scared." Ping Yongka figured out that this little girl wasn't a ghost, but she had something to do with his family. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously. He was the youngest brother of the Shinhua Peak, so he had taken all the advantages. Not to mention that Gu Qing and Yuan Chu had taken care of him. Cain Yang had even rubbed his head affectionately when he met her on the chessboard mountain. If a younger one came, Apiao raised her small face and said proudly, "I'm teacher's closed-door disciple, Apiao. Who are you?" Hearing the words, closed-door disciple, Ping Yongka became anxious, thinking why? I've only been the closed-door disciple for a few years. How come there's another one? Before he could hug Jingjiu's thigh and complain about his grievance, Apiao said pitifully, "I'm a girl. Why are you fighting with me?" Ping Yongka was taken aback, thinking that what she said was reasonable. He would be the youngest uncle of the Aoyama sect in the future, so what should he be afraid of? Seeing that he had been dealt with, Apiao continued to persuade Jingjiu. She raised her small face and said pitifully, "Teacher, please let me go. My state is low and I can't help you." Jingjiu was impervious to fire and water, so he didn't care about this soft sword. He said, "Since you want to learn the art of emperors from me, these days are the best time." Apiao was on the verge of breaking down. She saw with her own eyes how her teacher tricked Gu Qing and the others back to Aoyama and locked them up in that manor cave, so she could guess that something big was going to happen next. This feeling of breaking down didn't subside even when she followed Jingjiu to the main hall of the palace and saw the legendary emperor in the human world. The emperor glanced at her and asked Jingjiu, "Is this the king of the underworld you chose for the lower world?" Jingjiu uttered and said, "I brought her here to learn from you." The emperor smiled and said, "I've been an emperor all my life and I've always been steady. What's there to learn?" Jingjiu said, "It's not easy to be steady." The former emperor faked his death and hid in the Guoqing temple, causing so much trouble in Taipingzhenren, and the Zhongzhou school looked on coldly from the sidelines. But the Jing imperial court could run smoothly for 300 years, and the human world didn't suffer from any war. It was a great merit and even a great achievement. The emperor walked to the stone steps in front of the grand hall and looked at the seemingly boundless square. He suddenly said, "Now that things have been steady for so many years, I hope they will continue to be steady in the future." Jingjiu said, "I promise you that the event will only take place in Zhaoga City. I think the immortal Tan has the same idea." The emperor let out a contented smile after receiving Jingjiu's promise, saying, "I'm already satisfied that you can come and keep me company during the last few days." Jingjiu said, "I feel unhappy every time I think about it." It was rare for him to express his feelings directly. Feeling surprised, the emperor turned to Jingjiu and asked, "You're used to seeing people go through life and death, but you still can't be indifferent?" "I can't be indifferent," said Jingjiu. The emperor stared into Jingjiu's eyes in silence and asked earnestly, "Why?" Jingjiu said, "It's because I'm afraid of death, and I'm also afraid that you too will die." The divine emperor suddenly laughed like a child. He laughed very happily. Jingjiu laughed out as well. He patted Jingjiu's shoulder and turned to leave the palace hall. Apiao followed behind Jingjiu, her face full of bewilderment, wondering what the two of them had talked about. After returning to the tranquil side hall, Ping Yongka winked at Apiao. Apiao returned the same expression, indicating that she didn't know anything. Jingjiu walked to the front of the window, looking at the distance calmly. Ping Yongka and Apiao also looked in the same direction. Jingjiu was the only one in the window. He looked a bit lonely, making the others feel sad. A person appeared in the round window of Shui Yu Nunnery's room. The old man wore a gray cloth, his forehead so broad that it seemed to be able to hold all the water of the lake outside the window. Standing on the green stone path by the lake, the master of Shui Yu Nunnery and the highly achieved swordsman of the nunnery looked at the old man in gray with a complicated expression in their eyes. Even the great formation of Shui Yu Nunnery couldn't block this person. The immortal Tan, the sect master of the Zhongzhou school, was indeed one of the strongest swordsmen in Chaotian. Yet, his behavior was extremely rude. If the person in the round window were still awake, Shui Yu Nunnery wouldn't allow himself to be humiliated like this. The immortal Tan pulled back his gaze from the inside of the window and bowed slightly to the master of the nunnery and the others, saying, "I'm sorry, but I have to do it. I hope the master of the nunnery can forgive me." Though Shui Yu Nunnery still couldn't forgive him, the others felt a bit better after he apologized to the nunnery. The master of the nunnery took 2 steps forward slowly and came to the front of the window. "Is the emperor going to leave for heaven?" she asked the immortal Tan. Everybody could guess the purpose of the immortal Tan's visit. Shui Yu Nunnery had always cultivated with a pure mind. All he cared about was guarding the heavenly well together with the Guoqing temple. Except for the one who was sleeping soundly, he seldom paid attention to the affairs of the cultivation circle. Even though Shui Yu Nunnery had favored Aoyama for some reason over the years, he had no grudge against the Zhongzhou school, and they had nothing to do with each other. The immortal Tan's sudden appearance and intimidating everyone with his unimaginable cultivation state was of course to bring that prince away. How could the son of a vixen become the emperor of the human race? The immortal Tan didn't answer the question of the master of the nunnery directly. Having said that, he walked toward the other side of the lake. Chapter 603. There was a lonely nunnery on the other side of the lake. Prince Jing Xian had been imprisoned there for many years. As the immortal Tan drew closer to the nunnery hall, the atmosphere by the lake grew increasingly tense. The people in the Shui Yu Nunnery had anxious looks on their faces as they looked at the abbess, waiting for her to make the final decision. Back then, the Emperor God wanted Prince Jing Xian to become a monk in Guoqing Temple. But because of Tai Pingzhenren, Zen Master was extremely dissatisfied with Aoyama and rejected the request. That was why Prince Jing Xian came to Shui Yu Nunnery. It was evident that the immortal Tan intended to take the Prince Jing Xian away because he wanted him to inherit the position of the emperor, but what about the current crown Prince Jingyao? If something happened, how would Shui Yu Nunnery explain to Aoyama sect? The gaze of the chief nun was fixed on the immortal Tan the entire time. The immortal Tan's footsteps looked casual and ordinary, but they actually had an extremely marvelous rhythm, as if they were one with heaven and earth. The lake water was as calm as ever, and the formation set up by Shui Yu Nunnery didn't sense it at all. Was this the highest realm of Taoism? The chief nun was fully aware that she was no match for the immortal Tan. Even though she had activated the Great Formation and all the swordsmen of the Shui Yu Nunnery, she still couldn't stop him. But could he just watch him take her away from Shui Yu Nunnery? The abbess suddenly thought of the crazy woman from Aoyama who came to cause trouble a few years ago. Determination flashed through her eyes as she prepared to strike. At this moment, the lake suddenly rippled. She was slightly startled, but her eyes gradually calmed down. It was unclear what the immortal Tan had sensed. He turned around to look at the surface of the lake and thought for a while. But he couldn't come up with an answer, so he kept walking forward. Under the gaze of Shui Yu Nunnery and the others, he came to the other side of the lake and walked into the nunnery. Prince Jing Xian was dressed in plain clothes and had been waiting behind the door. The immortal Tan fixed his line of sight on Jingjiu and found some ink stains on his palms and cotton cloth. He knew that Jingjiu was not as calm as he appeared to be. "Greetings, sect leader." The Prince Jing Xian bowed deeply to the immortal Tan. The immortal Tan looked at Jingjiu in silence, saying nothing, nor did he ask Jingjiu to get up. A gentle breeze caressed the surface of the lake, causing ripples to rise again. The sparse branches trembled slightly. Time passed slowly. Prince Jing Xian maintained his posture of bowing to the ground, his body trembling slightly. He understood what the immortal Tan meant. His mother was a member of the Zhongzhou school, so it was okay for him to kneel before the immortal Tan according to their status. but he knew very well what it meant to kneel at this moment. It meant that the system of the plum meeting, which had lasted for more than 600 years, would come to an end. The immortal Tan didn't exude any energy, nor did he intend to pressure Tong Yen. He waited calmly for Tong Yen to make a decision. After an unknown amount of time, Jing Xian finally couldn't hold on any longer. His legs went soft and he knelt on the ground. When his knees came into contact with the ground, a muffled thud could be heard. The immortal Tan sighed and waved his hand to dismantle the formation on the door-sill. He looked back at the round window, and flew away from Shuiyu Nunnery with Jing Xian, heading toward Zhaoga City. The gentle breeze rose again, and the ripples appeared on the surface of the lake again. It was quiet in Shuiyu Nunnery. The chief nun pulled back her gaze from the horizon and walked into the meditation room expressionlessly. "You should know who she is," she said to the woman kneeling on the floor. The woman wore an ordinary dress, with a silver bell tied around her exposed wrist. She had a charming yet elegant appearance. She was none other than the assassin of Bulo Lin, Nan Zheng. Nan Zheng was sent by Nan Wang to Shuiyu Nunnery to inquire about Lian Sanyue, but her intention was soon discovered by Shuiyu Nunnery. "I had my suspicions when Nan Wang asked me to come here and keep an eye on her." Looking at the woman sleeping soundly, Nan Zheng continued, "I met her many years ago, and I know how outstanding she is. I'd be too stupid if I couldn't figure out her identity." The chief nun walked over and reached out her hand to pluck a strand of soft hair from Guodong's cheek, saying, "It's a pity that she won't wake up again. Otherwise," she didn't finish the sentence as she said to Nanjing, "Go to Zhaoga City and tell the royal palace that Jing Xian has left, and I'll spare your life." Nanjing lifted her head and looked at the chief nun confusedly, wondering why the chief nun asked her to do such an important thing. Could it be that she could travel faster than the immortal Tan? The chief nun said, "You can go there in the small green curtain sedan. You'll be able to get there in time." A drizzle fell on Zhaoga City, extinguishing the heat that had just arisen at the end of spring. The search outside the city gate was still strict, and the streets and alleys in the city were still crowded. A youth in red clothing was walking on the street with a little girl in green clothing. The little girl looked at the various street scenes, but her eyes, which should have been filled with interest, were full of caution. Even in Dongyi Dao, very few people would wear red clothes except for when they were getting married. However, when paired with the young man's clean and amiable face, the red clothes were not dazzling. Instead, they made people feel comfortable and attracted the attention of many women. "Don't worry so much," the youth in red clothing said to the little girl in green clothing with a smile. "We've met often over the last few years and traveled a lot. When did I ever predict anything about you?" The little girl in green clothing shot him a glance, her expression full of distrust. "He's a man, how can I trust him? You sound more and more like a regular person." The youth in red clothing laughed and said, "You have the green sky mirror, so you can return it at any time. No man can deceive you." The little girl in green clothing said, "I don't think I'm that formidable." The youth in red clothing said, "The true spirit of the heavenly state is born with the world in it. Your cultivation state is the highest in Chaotian. Though you can't fight, you should be able to protect yourself." The little girl was none other than the spirit of the green sky mirror, Qing, but who was the youth in red clothing? Was he the red bird that had landed on the tree branch back then? "Why did you bring me to Zhaoga City?" asked Qing. The youth said, "To watch the show." "Where are your subordinates?" asked Qing. "Where is that pheasant?" The youth displayed a helpless expression as he said, "It's the dark phoenix." Qing snorted while raising her head, saying, "I can only regard it as a pheasant." "It's the dark phoenix," the youth said in a calm and determined tone. "It's still recuperating from its wound." Qing was aware that he had a different opinion of the bird, so she asked curiously, "Do you think you are a family because your family name is Een? I didn't have this family name before, but I might have thought of it when I was given this name back then. It was true that this youth in red clothing was Tai Pingzhenren, who had succeeded in total transformation, and Yin San, who had left Aoyama. Ching stopped teasing him and asked, "Where is that bald guy?" Yin San said, "This place is too close to the Cloud Dream Mountain, so the young mysterious Dark Master can't come to Zhaoga City. Otherwise, the unicorn would be very angry if he smelled his scent." Ching turned her head sideways and shot him a glance, asking, "What about you? Everyone in the world is angry with you. How dare you come to Zhaoga City? Aren't you afraid of death?" Yin San said, "It's hard for people like us to die even if we want to." Hearing the word, us, Ching asked after a moment of silence, "What show are we going to watch?" Looking at the royal palace in the distance, Yin San said sentimentally, "The emperor is going to die soon. The fight for the throne is of course a big show." This was the first time Ching had heard of this, so she was startled. "Is something going to happen?" she asked. "Nothing is new in the world." Looking at the endless horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians on the street, Yin San said, "All the families will go to Zhaoga City. The Zhongzhou school will definitely bring Jing Xian back to fight for the throne." Shuiyu Nunnery had no one to fight with, so he could only watch from the sidelines. Yamatsai seemed to be impartial, but in fact, he only knew how to smooth things over. "To guard against me, the Guoqing Temple has set up a rule that no one is allowed to interfere in the affairs of the imperial court, so they can't embarrass themselves. As for the other cultivation sects, they can only be witnesses at most, which is of no use." Ching felt that what he said would become true, so she asked, "Hasn't the emperor appointed the crown prince? There must be a will." "A will is always the most useless thing. Nobody knows it better than our Aoyama sect." Yin San pointed to the young girls in front of the stalls and the scholars walking hand in hand, and said, "These people will die soon." "You're so cruel," Ching said while looking at him in disgust. Yin San shook his head and said, "After the plum meeting, the imperial court became the bridge between the mortal world and the cultivation world. As time went by, it grew stronger with the support of both the cultivation practitioners and the mortal world, and eventually became a fortress. No cultivation sect would give it up. If they didn't want to fight for it, they had to give up the imperial court." Ching widened her eyes and asked worriedly, "Wouldn't the world be in chaos?" Yin San said, "Only after the chaos can there be a great rule." Ching was aware of his evil idea, so she asked cautiously, "Do you still want to kill all the mortals?" Yin San said with a small smile, "Those who can't survive in the chaotic world probably shouldn't live in the first place." Ching moved away from him reflexively, saying, "You're a madman. Why do you want to do this?" Yin San said calmly, "It's the only way for the human race to grow stronger." Ching thought it was impossible to communicate with this madman, so she asked, "Why do we have to grow stronger?" Yin San said nonchalantly, "If the human race can't grow stronger, they will be wiped out one day." Ching was taken aback. As she was about to ask more questions, she suddenly sensed a familiar energy fluctuation in the sky in the northwest. A strong wind rose in Zhaoga City, and the ocean of clouds was blown away in all directions. A dozen large cloud boats arrived slowly, casting a huge shadow on the ground. In a short time, the cloud boats of Zhongzhou School arrived outside Zhaoga City, blocking the sun. The streets and alleys suddenly became dark, and the populace looked at the sky in fear. Soon after, screams broke out. The chaos was imminent. It was evident that the imperial court had been prepared for this. Along with the thunderous hoofbeats, the entire magic army was dispatched to maintain the order together with the government officials, and at the same time evacuating the populace from the city. The squeaking sounds could be heard from the city walls and the buildings. The eaves and roofs of the buildings were opened, revealing at least hundreds of divine crossbows. The arrows as thick as an arm were aimed at the sky. In the dim light, The amulets carved on the arrows glowed, looking like the stars that had come to the human world ahead of time. However, it was almost impossible to resist the dozen cloud boats of Zhongzhou school with these divine crossbows. Qing looked at the sky in the south with a worried expression, asking, "Where are the sword boats of Aoyama?" Yin San said, "The Aoyama sect doesn't participate in the political affairs of the imperial court. This is also the rule of the plum meeting. It's a bit too much to send the sword boats here." Qing was startled, asking, "Won't Aoyama send someone here?" Yin San said with a faint smile, "Haven't I come here already?" Chapter 604. Gu Pan's finger moved over the arrow of the divine crossbow slowly, pausing for a moment when it passed by those amulets. Gu Pan pulled back his finger and looked at the cloud boats in the sky, a complicated emotion in his eyes. He was the vice commander of the magic army of Zhaoga City. Though his position sounded the same as before, it was actually a few levels higher, and he had a higher power. Yet, he was still a graduate of the external sect of Zhongzhou School, and now he was responsible for the defense of the cloud boats of Zhongzhou School. It was a preposterous thing to do. However, there were too many people like him in the imperial court and in the army, so the imperial court couldn't dismiss all of them just because they were afraid of Zhongzhou School. In the higher city gate tower, the chief commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau, Zhang Eai, was also looking at the sky, his narrowed eyes devoid of any emotion. He was also a graduate of Zhongzhou School, but he had drifted away from Cloud Dream Mountain after the turmoil of the Fiend Prison, and became the most loyal chancellor of the Emperor. A dozen large cloud boats had cast a great shadow on Zhaoga City, and also cast a great shadow on everybody's mind. It was evident that Zhongzhou School intended to use its power to suppress them. No matter how strong the defense of Zhaoga City was, it was impossible for it to withstand such a force. Moreover, there were too many people in the imperial court who were on the side of Cloud Dream Mountain. Who knew how many officials in the Pure Heaven Bureau, the Magic Army and the government offices would change sides at the critical moment. Zhang Yi remained silent, and he was ready to die in the battle. Unlike other chancellors and generals, he had no chance of returning to Cloud Dream Mountain. Even if he were to die in the battle, he would still let Zhaoga City hold on for a while longer, until the masters of Yamatsai came out to uphold justice, until the sword boats of Aoyama appeared in the southern sky, and until the emperor left safely. However, the Zhongzhou School couldn't conceal such a large force from anybody, and they didn't intend to conceal it from the world. The imperial court had known it 3 days ago, but why hadn't Aoyama sent anyone here yet? He retracted his gaze and looked at the city wall. He saw Gu Pan beside the divine crossbow. After a moment of silence, he said something to the deputy commander beside him. The Jing imperial court had prepared for such a situation a long time ago. The Magic Army and the Pure Heaven Bureau had conducted many drills over the years, including one during the turmoil of the Fiend Prison. The chaotic situation in Zhaoga City was soon alleviated by the heavy cavalry and the flying sedan. The residents began to evacuate to the outside of the city in an orderly manner. In particular, the deep mansions near the imperial city were quickly emptied. With the help of the guards of Taichung Temple and the Gu clan, the Jing family successfully left Zhaoga City and arrived at the Zhao Garden outside the city. All of Chaotian knew that Jingjiu was either the all-in-one sword devil or the reincarnation of the immortal Jingyang, and that he had nothing to do with the Jing house in Zhaoga City. But nobody dared make things difficult for them. Though Zhao Juyi had white hair on his head, he was in good spirit. He bowed to the Grand Master Jing and led Jing Shang to the edge of the pond. Looking at the cloud boats in the sky, he said with a worried expression, "I don't think Zhaoga City will be able to hold out for much longer. You two have to take a rest for a while and then head southward." Jing Shang had a lot of white hair on his temples, but he was in good spirits. Hearing this, he felt startled, asking, "Uncle, aren't you going?" The Aoyama sect was the foundation of the Jing and Zhao families. The Jing family had to go to Aoyama if they headed southward. If Zhaoga City falls into the hands of the Zhongzhou school, it would be meaningless to retreat to Aoyama. A hint of ruthlessness flashed in Zhao Juye's eyes as he said, "I don't believe that Aoyama will allow them to act so arrogantly." After a moment of silence, Jing Shang said, "I'll bring my father and the others to Zhuozhou, and then come back to take a look with you." Having finished inspecting the divine crossbows on the city wall, Gu Pan walked down a narrow staircase on the side of the city wall for 100 feet, turned right, and entered a secret door. There was a tunnel behind the secret door, leading to the foot of the city wall. There was a large space there, where all kinds of magic treasures were set up. The amulet scripts were carved on the walls, and the lines drawn by the cold silver were transmitted into the city wall continuously. This large formation stretched for more than 10 miles. It wasn't used to provide the indestructible magic power for the city wall of Zhaoga City, but to provide the yuanqi for the divine crossbows on the city wall. If someone tried to destroy the city wall, the divine crossbows in Zhaoga City would become a pile of broken bronze and iron after firing a few times. Normally, even though Gu Pan was the commander of the magic army, he wouldn't be allowed to enter this place at such a critical moment because of his background in the Zhongzhou school. The emperor trusted him very much, and according to the rules of the imperial court, nobody could enter this place alone. 3 qualified chancellors had to come with him. Gu Pan was accompanied by 2 others. One of them was the deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau, and the other was the assistant minister of the Rites Ministry, who was in charge of the small seal of the forbidding formation. Standing on the high stone platform and looking down at the forbidding formation, his line of sight followed the cold silver lines upward, as if he wanted to see through the city wall and those divine crossbows. It was unclear what he was thinking. The deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau shot him a glance, but didn't say anything. The assistant minister of the Rites Ministry looked a bit nervous, his face pale. The forbidding formation had suddenly sensed something. As the green light spread out, a small black speck could be seen clearly, approaching from the south at an unimaginable speed. Judging from its size, the black speck couldn't be the sword boat of Aoyama. Was it Yuan Qijing or Fang Jingtian who came alone? Or was it someone else? Gu Pan raised his eyebrows slightly and raised his right hand, ready to order the magic army to strengthen the defense. The deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau shot him another glance, saying, "It's the great grandmaster of Shui Yu Nunnery. Don't be nervous." Gu Pan pulled back his right hand from the air and placed it on the railing, his knuckles a bit pale. It was a small green curtained sedan that came from the south. The divine crossbows on the city wall didn't fire, and the great formation of the royal palace opened a passage, allowing the small green curtained sedan to stop in front of the grand hall of the royal palace like a falling leaf. Countless gazes were fixed on the sedan from inside the grand hall, under the palace walls and behind the pillars. The curtain of the small green curtained sedan quivered slightly. The people were curious, wondering if the great grandmaster who had never shown her face would show her true appearance today. Why did she come here? Was it because of the cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school or some other significant event? Nanjing walked out from the small green curtained sedan, her face a bit pale, the silvery bell on her wrist giving off a crisp sound. The people were certain that she was not the great grandmaster of Shui Yu Nunnery, because her cultivation state and age were both very low, so they couldn't help but feel startled. Nanjing came before the grand hall and knelt down, saying, "Jing Xian has been taken away by the immortal Tan. He should be on his way to Zhaoga City." Hearing this, the chancellors and generals in the grand hall burst into an uproar, all of them looking up at the highest point. The emperor looked at the distance in silence, his expression unchanged. It seemed that he had predicted this would happen. The great formation of the royal palace had been activated. Even the cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school would have a hard time breaking in. The chancellors in the Grand Hall were calm enough, but they couldn't be as calm as the emperor. Their gazes followed the emperor to look at the distance, passing through the broad square and the invisible barrier of the formation, and landed on a tall building with flying eaves outside the royal palace. The tall building was the Intian Gate in the south of the city. The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school was a cloud in the cloudless sky. There was a cloud above the Intian Gate as well. A figure could be vaguely seen in the cloud, her white dress drifting out of the cloud once in a while, bringing out a few strands of silk. She was none other than Bai Zhenren of the Zhongzhou school. The court meeting for today is over. You can go back now, dear chancellors. The emperor withdrew his gaze from the distance and said to the people in the grand hall with a smile. There were many factions in the Jing imperial court, so the high-ranking officials in the grand hall had their own standpoints. Some of them supported the crown prince Jing Yao. Some of them were still obsessed with Prince Jing Xian. Some of them were from the center sect, and some of them had studied at the one cottage house for many years. But hearing this, regardless of their standpoints, the chancellors all felt a strong sense of sorrow. This should be the last court meeting of His Majesty. Prime Minister Tsun slowly walked out of the ranks, then slowly knelt down and bowed to the emperor. His hair was as white as snow. Then, the state dukes, chancellors, and generals of the immortal army stepped out of the ranks and knelt down in front of the throne. No matter which faction they belonged to, they were all sincere. The emperor didn't seem to have expected this scene. He was slightly startled, then he laughed heartily and said, "It seems that being imprisoned in this palace for more than 300 years is not a loss." After saying this, he got up from the throne and came to the chancellors. He first helped the elderly Prime Minister Tsun up, then slowly helped the other chancellors up. When he finally helped the young deputy commander of the Northern Immortal Army up, this military general who killed without blinking in the northern borderline was already in tears and couldn't stand steadily. Under the watchful eyes of the chancellors, the emperor walked out of the grand hall, looked into the distance and asked, "Is it going to start now?" His voice was like the sunshine in spring, warm and far away. It floated in the grand imperial city, and then spread to the Intian Gate more than 10 miles away. Bai Zhenren stood on the Intian Gate. The mist around him gradually dispersed, revealing an indescribably real face. She said indifferently, "Your Majesty, the Zhongzhou school has always respected you, so before you leave, nothing will start." The emperor clasped his hands behind his back, his yellow robe fluttering. He said with a smile, "After I leave, what can the Zhongzhou school do? Why do you have to do this, Your Majesty? We all know what's going to happen." Bai Zhenren said, "Who in the imperial court, the major cultivation sects, the merchants and the populace will accept a son of a vixen as the emperor of the human race." In a room to the side of the grand hall, the royal concubine Hu and the crown prince Jing Yao were watching the conversation from more than 10 miles away by the window. Hearing the voice of Bai Zhenren, a hint of anger showed on royal concubine Hu's face, but Jing Yao remained calm and held his mother's hand. The expression on royal concubine Hu's face eased a bit, but a hint of sadness showed in the deep end of her eyes. The chancellors in the grand hall didn't show much reaction, because they all knew what the Zhongzhou school wanted. The chancellors who had the background of the Zhongzhou school remained silent, and those who had the opposite opinion could do nothing but remain silent. Bai Zhenren continued, "We won't force the emperor to change the will or depose the crown prince. In short, we won't do anything. You can go back peacefully." Hearing this, the palace fell into a dead silence. She mentioned going back, the will, and deposing the crown prince. That meant that everything had been explained. Chapter 605. Prime Minister Tsun came to the gate of the grand hall, letting the wind ruffle his white hair. Looking in the direction of the Intian Gate, he yelled, Do you think the Zhongzhou school can convince the public by doing this? Seeing that the Prime Minister was the first to step out, the crowd was surprised. Though Yamatsai had been neutral all these years, it was still an ally of the Zhongzhou school. As this powerful statement broke out, a strong wind broke out in the sky, and a shadow appeared in the sky in the east. The boat of diligent study of the one cottage house dropped down from the sky at an unimaginably high speed, and then hovered steadily over the royal palace. If the Zhongzhou school's boat of diligent wanted to break into the royal palace, it would have to encounter the boat of diligent of Yamatsai. Many scholars stood on the boat of diligent, looking extremely solemn. Bai Zhenren's expression didn't change. Looking at Bu Qiuxiao at the bow of the boat, he said, House Master Bu was forced to concede by the Aoyama sect's despicable tricks. It's fine. Are you going to protect the fox spirit's son now? Bu Qiuxiao said. Back then, 2 disciples of Aoyama said to Yuner, education without discrimination. I've thought about it carefully, and I think it's quite reasonable. Behind him, Shi Yun was calm and silent. Lu Shisui was curious, thinking that such nice words must have come from his young master, but who was the messenger, Gu Qing? If Zhuo Ruzhui were here, he would definitely shout, it's me, it's me. Bai Zhenren said, earlier, Prime Minister, you said that Zhongzhou school can't convince the public. I'm also curious about whether the teachers in the house all agree with House Master Bu's wish to worship the fox spirit's son as the emperor. Hearing this, Shi Yun and Lu Shisui's expressions changed slightly, and the dozen middle-aged scholars on the boat of diligent frowned slightly. It was obvious that Yamatsai had different opinions on this matter, but Bu Qiuxiao had suppressed them forcefully. If Bu Qiuxiao wanted to go against the Zhongzhou school for Jingyao, the crack would probably get deeper and deeper. Something bad might happen on the spot. Bu Qiuxiao had made up his mind a long time ago. He looked at Bai Zhenren and said, I don't care about the succession of the emperor, but I can't watch your Zhongzhou school behave like this. Immortal, have you ever thought about what will happen to the common people once you start a war with the Aoyama sect? This was the philosophy that Yamatsai had upheld for tens of thousands of years. The ruler was light and the people were important. It seemed that Bai Zhenren had anticipated Yamatsai's request, saying, I promise you that everything that has happened today will only happen in Zhaoga City. No, Bu Qiuxiao said resolutely, his voice as crisp and forceful as the knocking of an inkstone. The populace in Zhaoga City won't be able to evacuate in time. Too many people will die. Bai Zhenren looked in the direction of the city walls and was silent for a while. Suddenly, he smiled and said, Okay, I promise you. Let's do it at the Imperial City. Bu Qiuxiao didn't expect the Zhongzhou school to agree to his request. He felt both baffled and helpless. All the major sects were well aware of the power of the great formation of the Imperial City, because it was built with the most powerful magic treasures and energy of the various sections. No matter how powerful the Zhongzhou school was, it would take a great deal of resources and even human lives to break through the great formation of the Imperial City. By that time, they would have to face the power of the Imperial Court and the Aoyama sect. Where did Bai Zhenren get his confidence from? Bai Zhenren had made an unexpected promise in exchange for Yamatsai's temporary neutrality. The Prime Minister Tsin and many other civil officials had no choice but to fall silent again. Silence followed silence. It was truly hilarious. The Emperor laughed out and pointed his right hand at the distant Intian Gate, saying, Please. He was inviting Bai Zhenren for a duel. Yet, Bai Zhenren had no intention of accepting the challenge. Our sect has always respected the Emperor, he said calmly. The Emperor has worked hard for more than 300 years, and it is the last day of his life. Why do you have to work so hard? After a moment of silence, the Emperor said, It seems reasonable. Having said that, he left the grand hall and entered the side hall. Royal concubine Hu and Jingyao came up to him. There were 2 cups of tea. The emperor and royal concubine who didn't say anything to each other. They talked about the past and the future casually, just like they did every night. They talked about how they met, how they fell in love, how they were separated, and how they reunited in the end. Standing by the side, Jing Yao didn't know what to do. He felt that he should leave, but he didn't want to. There was a quiet room in the deep end of the side hall. Jing Jiu sat by the window, looking at the unattractive flowers and trees in the imperial harem. He held a cup of tea in his hand, but didn't take a sip. Apiao and Ping Yongka stood by the door, eavesdropping on the conversation between the emperor and royal concubine who, listening intently. After a long while, Apiao turned her head around and looked at Ping Yongka, asking confusedly, "They are talking about love affairs and family affairs. What kind of emperor's method is this?" Ping Yongka replied indignantly, "You ask me. Do you think I should ask my master?" Apiao nodded forcefully, saying, "That's what I meant." It was impossible for Ping Yongka to ask Jingjiu. Even though he had behaved straightforwardly, he was not an idiot. He knew that his master was in a bad mood that day, so there was no point in asking him. Jingjiu and Apiao were well aware of the reason why Jingjiu was in a bad mood. In fact, the whole of Zhaoga City, and even the whole of Chaotian would soon know the reason. The setting sun had already set to the west of the distant West Ocean. The darkness of the night occupied the sky. The stars in the sky were mostly covered by the black cloud boats, looking a bit dreadful. The divine crossbows on the city walls were aimed at the night sky. It was unclear if they intended to shoot down the stars or do something else. The court meeting had been over for a long time, but the chancellors hadn't left yet. It was because this might be the last night of the emperor's life, and it was also because many of their manors were empty. What would they eat and drink when they went back? The evacuation of the populace in Zhaoga City was still going on. The streets were full of noises and noises. As for those pitiful people who had been trampled to death, they had no time to worry about them. A dozen cloud boats hovered in the starlight in silence. They had no intention of attacking, waiting quietly. The whole world was waiting, but something had happened while they were waiting. Some figures gradually appeared in the seemingly deathly quiet manors and courtyards. It was unclear if they were about to wake up because of the night or some conspiracy. Two figures appeared in the mansion of the minister of the Ministry of Rites. They were a youth in red and a young woman in green. The food in the manor of the minister is pretty good. The pastries are made on the same day even at such a time. Yin San placed 2 plates of exquisite pastries on the table, motioning for Qing to have a taste. Qing wasn't in the mood to eat at the moment. Looking at those huge shadows in the starry sky, her eyes full of worry. In the forbidding formation under the city wall, Gu Pan, the deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau and the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, had been standing there for 10 hours without eating or drinking anything. The officials responsible for maintaining the operation of the forbidding formation couldn't help but glance at the stone platform every once in a while, feeling that the atmosphere there was even more intense than that in the royal palace. Time passed slowly. The starlight in the night sky grew brighter and brighter. All of a sudden, all the stars in the sky glowed together, as if it were daytime in Zhaoga City. Along with the morning sunlight, the bell in the deep part of the palace rang out. The emperor has left. The deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau opened and closed his chapped lips slightly, indicating that he was shocked. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites murmured with a pale face, "All the people in Zhaoga City have been evacuated." Gu Pan said expressionlessly, "The emperor didn't leave until all the people were evacuated." The morning sunlight faded away and the world returned to the dark night. The cries could be heard in the royal palace. Everybody knelt down on the ground, weeping bitterly toward the side hall. Even though they were the officials from the Zhongzhou school, their sorrow was sincere at the moment. The emperor had been on the throne for 300 years, and it was the most peaceful 300 years in Chaotian. This peaceful and happy time was his gift to the world. The saying, "those who were good at fighting are not famous," was used to describe someone like him. In the manor house of the minister, San took out a green cloth from somewhere and changed it into the red cloth he was wearing. Qing'er mocked, "What a hypocrite!" San said, "He is a good emperor, much better than his father and uncle." The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school in the sky retreated a bit. The patch of cloud and fog above the Intian gate dispersed a bit more. Bai Jinren lowered his head slightly. The scholars of Yamatsai on the boat of hardship all expressed their condolences. Royal concubine who crouched on the bed and looked at the dispersing light specks, her eyes full of sorrow and despair. She was on the verge of passing out. Jing Yao knelt by her side and held her hand tightly, his face full of tears and worry. Seeing this, Apiao and Ping Yongka felt sympathetic. Jing Jiu by the window didn't turn his head around. "Your Majesty, please ascend the throne." The voice of the Minister of the Rites Ministry was trembling slightly, but loud enough in the grand hall. Hearing this, royal concubine whose body trembled slightly, and she came back to her senses with difficulty. She pushed her son's hand away forcefully and said while staring into his eyes, "You can cry at night." Jing Yao wiped the tears off his face and uttered in a sobbing voice. He got up and walked toward the grand hall. It was only a distance of 100 feet from the side hall to the grand hall. As he appeared in front of the chancellors and generals of the Jing imperial court, he had already calmed down, with a determined expression on his face, but his eyes were still red. Seeing Crown Prince Jing Yao walking toward the throne, the chancellors had complicated emotions. Regardless of whether they supported or opposed the Crown Prince's decision, they had to admit that the Crown Prince had performed well at the moment, but they were also aware that he couldn't sit on the throne so easily. On the Intian gate, looking at the cluster of palaces, Bai Jinren said calmly, "Open the formation." A dozen cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school approached the royal palace slowly. The starlight was blocked from time to time, and the shadows were on the verge of swallowing the cluster of palaces. The divine crossbows on the city walls didn't fire. It was probably because they hadn't received the order yet. Whoosh! A faint green circle of light appeared in the night sky, at least 10 square miles in circumference, enshrouding the entire royal palace. This was the great formation of the royal palace built by the various sects in Zhaoga City. It was usually invisible, but it reflected the starlight and the cloud boats, looking like a large smooth bubble. The great formation of the royal palace couldn't burst like a bubble. Besides the great formation of Cloud Dream and the great formation of Aoyama, this was the strongest defensive formation in Chaotian. Was the Zhongzhou school going to use the cloud boats to attack? Right at this moment, an extremely unimaginable thing happened. The color of the circle of light grew fainter, and it became thinner in the perception of the people. Countless gazes were fixed on the cloud boats, stunned speechless. It turned out that Zhaoga City had been under the control of the Zhongzhou school the entire time. That was why Bai Jinren agreed to Bu Qiuxiao's request so calmly. As everybody thought that the great formation of the royal palace had collapsed, the person by the window in the side hall of the royal palace had finally spoken. "Do it," Jingju said. Meanwhile, in the manor house of the minister of the ritual ministry, San said while looking at the cloud boats in the starry sky, "Kill them." Chapter 606. In the deep underground of the city wall of Zhaoga City, the forbidding formation responsible for supplying Yuanqi to the divine crossbows was operating normally. The reason the divine crossbows didn't attack the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school was that it was chaotic on the platform, and the magic army on the city wall hadn't received any orders. The deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau was lying in a pool of blood, his body full of scorch marks. He should have been killed by a magic treasure of Thunder State. As for the bloody hole in his chest and his yuanying that had turned into green smoke, It was unclear who did it. Gao Jingxiu colluded with the outsiders to destroy the forbidding formation, and he has been killed. Gu Pan said to the officials below the platform in a deep voice, "Please maintain the formation. As soon as we receive the order from the royal palace, the divine crossbows will attack." Nobody doubted what he said, because they all saw what the deputy commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau, Master Gao, intended to do. Yet, they couldn't react immediately, wondering if Gu Pan wasn't an external disciple of the Zhongzhou school. Was he the one who killed Gao Jingxiu? Gu Pan rubbed his fingertips, which were still emitting green smoke, and looked at the assistant minister of the ritual ministry not far away. The assistant minister of the ritual ministry still looked pale, but Gu Pan knew that it wasn't because he was frightened. The bloody hole in Gao Jingxiu's chest and the broken yuanying were all the work of this master. The two of them looked away after a brief eye contact, without exchanging a single word. Turns out he is a man of Bulolin, Gu Pan thought to himself as he walked outside. The assistant minister of the ritual ministry turned around and looked at his back, thinking that he was a spy of the Zhongzhou school, but no one expected him to be a member of the curtain rollers. Gu Pan came to the stone steps outside the city wall from the hidden door. After taking a look at the cloud boat in the starry sky, he walked to the highest tower of the city wall and bowed to the chief commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau, Zhang Yai, saying calmly, "It's been taken care of." The blood was everywhere on the stargazing platform, flowing down the stone steps. A young servant in green clothing walked to the pile of corpses, and it took him a while to find the corpse of Qin Tianjing. He pulled open Qin Tianjing's finger and took out an object. Many generations of High Duke Zhan had led the immortal guards and governed their mansions strictly, but they couldn't do anything to his mother. Many people in Zhaoga City had been evacuated that day, but the Grandmaster insisted that she wouldn't leave until her son came back from the royal palace. The Duke's wife couldn't dissuade the old lady, so she was very anxious and helpless. In the end, it was the Crown Prince of Duke Shan who decided to stay and take care of his grandmother, that his mother and the rest of the people in the mansion were persuaded to leave. At that moment, the old lady of the High Duke's public house was lying on the bed. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Her body was heaving up and down, and her throat was making sounds, but she could not speak. The Crown Prince of State Duke Shan had a handsome appearance, and looked very mature and steady. Back then, he had failed to propose marriage to the Prime Minister's manor, but it seemed like he had made some progress. He sat on the edge of the bed, ignoring his grandmother who was in extreme pain. His left hand reached into the quilt and searched for a long time. Finally, he felt something, and his face revealed a happy expression. The matriarch felt it and her face turned red. She forced out a sentence, "Unfilial son." "I'm your grandson, not your son," said the Crown Prince of State Duke Shan with a smile as he headed toward the outside of the room with the object in his hand. The matriarch was both angry and anxious. She breathed her last with her eyes wide open before she could catch her breath. As he came to the outside of the room, the Crown Prince of State Duke Shan handed the object in his hand to Jingli, saying, "Fortunately, I didn't fail you." Jingli shot a glance at the room and asked, "Do you need help?" It was hard for him to accept the fact that his grandson had killed his grandmother. "She died with her eyes open anyway," said the Crown Prince of State Duke Shan with a smile. Jingli said to him, "I regret offending you back then." The Crown Prince of State Duke Shan said seriously, "I can't be loyal and filial at the same time. I had no choice but to do it. I'm not evil and cruel." In the next moment, his expression changed as he asked nervously, "When will you detoxify me?" Jingli said, "It's a poisonous insect of the south, which can't be detoxified by any medicine. The mother of the poisonous insect is in the hands of the royal concubine. If the emperor can't ascend the throne, the royal concubine must be unwilling to live alone." Hearing this, the crown prince of state Duke Shan grew even more nervous, thinking that the royal concubine wouldn't be in the mood to save his life before she died if she wanted to commit suicide. Should I go to the palace to persuade my father? Or should I sneak attack him? The affairs in the palace are not something we can influence. You should stay in the manor house and pray that State Duke Shan won't do anything reckless in the Grand Hall. Having said that, Jingli left the manor house of State Duke Shan, and handed the object in his hand to a captain of the Divine Army. The forbidding formation under the city wall, the stargazing platform, the manor house of State Duke Shan. Similar situations were taking place in many places in Zhaoga City. The great formation of the royal palace was composed of 13 formations, each of which had a center of the formation. The center of the formation might be a flower pot or a life board, placed in 13 different places. This was the biggest secret of the Jing royal family. Apart from the emperor, nobody knew where the centers of the formation were, at least not all of them. Earlier, when Bai Jinren said that the formation would be opened, the great formation of the royal palace showed a sign of dispersing. It was because some people who held the center of the formation were acting according to her will. Now that those people were all dead, the center of the formation was taken back by the royal palace. This was the preparation of the emperor. Even though he had left for one night, he was still in control of this capital and this imperial court. As he said to Bai Jinren, what could they do even if this emperor was gone? It was true that there were many people loyal to the Cloud Dream Mountain in all the ministries, the magic army and those clans. The Zhongzhou school had prepared for this day for many years, but how many years had the emperor prepared for it? He had prepared for this for 300 years. It was impossible for him to let the Zhongzhou school seize the control of Zhaoga City overnight. The curtain rollers seemed to be an intelligence organization on the surface, but in fact they had sneaked into every corner of the imperial court, ready to display their will at any moment. More importantly, there was another undercurrent helping the imperial court in the dark night of Zhaoga City. The stargazing platform was bathed in blood, and a clan was burned to ashes. It was all because of the undercurrent. Bulow Lin had used the assassins who had been hiding for many years, and those who had been hiding the most had taken action that night. Together with the means of the curtain rollers, the Zhongzhou school was caught unprepared. In the manner of the Minister of Rites, Qing looked at Yin San, who had put on the red cloth again, and asked confusedly, "Don't you want the world to be in chaos? Why do you want to stop the Zhongzhou school?" Yin San said with a faint smile, "The Zhongzhou school is very powerful. If they are allowed to control the situation quickly, how can there be chaos?" In the deepest part of the underground of the royal palace, an unknown confrontation was taking place in an unknown place. If someone saw the two people confronting each other, they would be shocked speechless. It was because they were Sir Jean and Sir Nyo. On the ground, there was a slowly rotating white jade plate that was currently emitting white light. As the light entered the air, it quickly disappeared without a trace. However, it did not truly disappear. Instead, it followed some invisible path and entered the entire imperial city. This place was the most important formation of the great formation of the royal palace. The emperor had passed away, and his two most trusted and closest Sir Jean were not by his side, because they had to guard the formation here. Sir Jean had no idea that the person he had to guard against was his old partner of hundreds of years. His line of sight passed through the smoke-like white glow and landed on the wrinkled face of Sir Nyo. "You asked me why I used my life magic treasure. What about you? Why did you hide the mysterious dark thorn above my head, ready to strike down at any moment?" In fact, the confrontation had lasted for several hours. They had focused all their attention and energy on each other. They knew how powerful and dangerous the other was, so they didn't dare to be distracted. As a result, they didn't say a word. Perhaps it was because the emperor had left, or perhaps it was because he felt bored, that Serene took the risk to speak and waited for Jin Mingqing's answer. The expression in Serene's eyes grew cold. "It's because your breathing has been disordered too many times today," he said. Jin Mingqing narrowed his eyes and asked, "You're not from Zhongzhou School?" After a moment of silence, Serene replied, "No." Jin Mingqing seemed to have realized something. "So you're from Bulolin," he said. The two of them relaxed their vigilance. At least, they didn't intend to die together with each other. Serene suddenly said, "I'm not from Bulolin." Jin Mingqing looked at him with narrowed eyes. Who would admit that? The great formation of the royal palace that was on the verge of being dismantled had suddenly recovered its full power. The scene that the people could see with their eyes was that the growing fainter and thinner circle of light had suddenly become sturdy again. The cloud boat of Zhongzhou School in the front had almost crashed into it. The bow of the boat had brushed against the green circle of light. Along with a loud boom, the stars in the sky had lost their colors. A large amount of energy of heaven and earth rushed toward the green circle of light violently, gushing out from it. The cloud boat's bow, which had a powerful formation attached to it, was completely destroyed after being brushed by the circle of light, exposing the inside of the boat. It looked rather miserable. In the next moment, the divine crossbows in the southeast corner of Zhaoga City fired together. A dozen flowing lights shot toward the cloud boat like flying swords. Along with the thunderous booms, a dozen fires broke out from the bottom of the cloud boat. It was damaged more severely, and it couldn't support the boat any longer, retreating toward the back of the night sky. The divine crossbows were few in number, and the shooting positions were quite safe. It was evident that they intended to issue a warning rather than start a war. Bu Qiuxiao and the scholars of Yamatsai were quite surprised, because they didn't expect the imperial court to be so well prepared. The chancellors in the royal palace had different expressions on their faces. Some of them looked happy, and some of them looked angry, especially those state dukes and generals who had the eye of the formation hidden in their homes. The expressions in their eyes were even more complicated. So many people had died in Zhaoga City, but Jing Yao hadn't even ascended the throne from the side hall. This was probably what it meant when the emperor took a step forward. Blood would flow from 1,000 miles away. He was still a few steps away from the chair. It was then. A general standing in the front suddenly swung his right arm toward Jing Yao from a distance. He was the commander of the Northern Magic Army, Xian Haichen. He was one of the most important figures in the military of the Jing imperial court. He had been summoned back to the capital by the emperor a few days ago, and he had been staying in the royal palace ever since. He was aware that the emperor was suspicious of him, but he didn't know why the emperor didn't execute him. The emperor was dead now. If Jing Yao ascended the throne, how many more days could he live? As such, he had to strike. Chapter 607. The formation in the royal palace sensed it immediately, and countless lines of glowing starlight fell down, resembling an illusory palace, pressing down on Xian Haichen. Xian Haichen was the most important figure in the military of the imperial court, so he of course knew how powerful this formation was. With a grunt, the soft armor hidden in his clothes suddenly expanded and turned into a huge puppet, blocking the illusory palace. Along with countless sounds, the puppet collapsed instantly, but it bought some time for Xian Haichen. The broadsword Will shot out from his arm was on the verge of cutting Jing Yao in half. Standing in the side hall, the royal concubine who looked at the scene with a pale face. She was about to reveal her tale without thinking too much, but she was stopped by a hand. There was a soft rustling sound. The broadsword that Xian Haichen had prepared for a long time finally landed, but it didn't land on Jing Yao, but on a piece of white cloth. That white robe had been sliced open by this saber strike, leaving behind a shallow gash. It was unclear when Jing Jiu had come to the scene. He reached out his hand to grab Xian Haichen's throat and lifted him into the air. Exhilarating Haichin let out a frustrated and angry howl, and his energy increased tremendously. He closed his hands like a fan, intending to smash his opponent's head into pieces. Having tempered himself in the northern border of the Snowy Kingdom for many years, he had an unimaginably strong body and a strength as great as a mountain. How could he allow himself to be lifted up like a chicken? Jingju didn't dodge, letting his opponent's hands fall on him. A loud bang reverberated in the hall. Exhilarating Haichin's hands landed on Jingju's face, but they didn't leave any mark. Yet, a spark burst out between Jingju's right hand and this person's neck. Crack! Exhilarating Haichin's hands dropped down powerlessly. Soon after, his head fell off, bouncing twice on the ground and then rolling far away. Jingju pulled back his right hand and caught the hair rope in the air. He tied his black hair back and walked past the chancellors to the outside of the grand hall. The first ray of sunlight appeared in the east and shone on his face, making it very clear. Countless suppressed screams broke out. The ministers had already guessed his identity. Many of them had already knelt down and greeted him as the sect leader or the immortal Jingyang. There were still many people who didn't move. They stood frozen in place, looking at him with vigilance or fear. Bai Zhenren's voice drifted over from the Intian Gate over 10 miles away. According to the rules of the Plum Meeting, the Aoyama sect can't interfere in the affairs of the royal family, even if you are the immortal Jingyang, not to mention that you are merely a sword devil. The ministers thought that he was right. Even if Jingjiu was the leader of Aoyama or even enlightened Jingyang, how could he interfere with the succession of the throne? Of course, according to the laws and regulations of the human world, Zhongzhou School had no reason to interfere, but the cultivation circle and Chaotian had to follow the rules of the Plum Meeting. Jingju didn't pay attention to Bai Zhenren and these ministers. He said directly, "Read the edict." No sooner had he said this than Duke Lu walked out from among the ministers. He looked much older than usual. The ministers were surprised to see him, but they thought it was reasonable. He was the most trusted minister of the emperor, so it was natural that the edict was in his hands. Duke Lu took out the edict and began to read it aloud. His hoarse voice echoed in the quiet palace hall. The content of the first half of the edict was quite normal. As expected, the emperor passed the throne to the crown prince Jing Yao, and Duke Lu, Prime Minister Qin and others were appointed ministers. Gu Qing was entrusted with an important task in the edict, and he had finally become the teacher of the emperor, which was expected by the people. But when the edict was read to the end, the people realized that it was the most important thing. The immortal Jingyang was supervising the state. What was more shocking was that the name of the emperor in the edict was not the immortal Jingyang, but the royal uncle Jingyang. Countless shocked gazes fell on Jingjiu. If he was the immortal Jingyang, he was also the uncle of the emperor. Why did the immortal Jingyang have such a close relationship with the royal family? Why hadn't anybody in Chaotian known about it for hundreds of years? It was true that everybody knew it was the character Jing. The character Jing referred to the scenery, the object Jing, the character Jing, the character Jing, the character Jing, the character Jing. Yet, there were so many people with the surname Jing in the world. Why did their surname have the character Jing? It was quiet in the grand hall. Nobody spoke a word. The people looked at the man in white in front of the grand hall in shock. By now they had vaguely understood why the emperor was so close to the Aoyama sect over the years. Some of the chancellors thought even further. They thought that the Aoyama sect gave up their influence in Zhaoga City in order to win the support of the Zhongzhou School at the Plum Meeting 600 years ago. Was it because of this? The immortal Jingyang was a senior member of the royal family to begin with, so how could the Zhongzhou School control the imperial court? Standing not far from the throne, Jing Yao listened to the will of his father. He came back to his senses after a long pause. He shot a glance in the direction of the side hall reflexively and saw his mother nod in agreement. He became more clear-headed and bowed to Jingjiu. "Your grandson greets royal granduncle," Jingjiu said without turning his head around. "Sit on the seat that belongs to you." The seat that belonged to the emperor was naturally the throne. Jingyao took a deep breath and walked toward the throne while holding the sword by his waist. His face was no longer pale, and his expression was more determined. Many years later, there were still many chancellors and generals in the imperial court who supported the Zhongzhou school and Jing Exin. Even though the sound of Duke Lu reading the will was still echoing in the rafters, many of them still stood out and were ready to stop it. There were even 2 generals and several guards who were ready to follow Commander Xin Haichen's example and kill Jing Yao here and now, even at the risk of being suppressed by the great array of the imperial court. Prime Minister Tsun and the chancellors who were ready to carry out the will of the late emperor were furious and were ready to act. Jingjiu stood in front of the hall and looked at the distant Intian gate without moving. There was a clang. Jing Yao's right hand, which was on the hilt of his sword, bounced off and the sword flew out of its sheath. An extremely cold sword light illuminated the dark palace hall. With a soft but terrifying cutting sound, the sword light pierced through the palace hall at an unimaginable speed. It was impossible to see with the naked eye, and one could only see arcs of light. The generals and guards stopped where they were, and then spider web-like marks appeared on their bodies. Finally, they became blood clots all over the ground. The cold sword light suddenly disappeared. There was another clanging sound. The sword had returned to the sheath at Jing Yao's waist. In the blink of an eye, those generals and guards with evil intentions and formidable fighting prowess had turned into the blood clots on the ground. Seeing the blood spreading out, some chancellors backed off in terror, some of them looked pensive, and most of them looked at Jingjiu directly. Everybody knew that the sword came from the sheath at Crown Prince Jing Yao's waist, but Jingjiu was the one who had wielded the sword. What kind of sword was it? It was so formidable that it could kill people invisibly, and it didn't have any lethal intent, as if it was not something in the human world. Even if the sword was of a high state, what kind of cultivation state did the person wielding the sword have to be in order to kill so many swordsmen in an instant? The whole of the cultivation circle, and even the upper echelons of Chaotian knew that Jingjiu was the youngest swordsman in the Broken Sea state in the history of cultivation, but was there such a formidable swordsman in the initial state of the Broken Sea? Even if he was the immortal Jingyang, the immortal Jingyang couldn't be so formidable when he was in the initial state of the Broken Sea. Is this Nan Chu's first child sword? Bai Zhenren's voice drifted over from the Intian gate a few miles away. Jingjiu corrected him. "This is my first child sword." Many years ago, the immortal Daoyuan employed the sword formation of Aoyama to cut down Nan Chu's Dao tree and snatched the first child sword before his death. He gave it to his favorite grand disciple, Jingyang. Since then, the first child sword had been in Jingyang's hands. More than 600 years ago, Jingjiu, Taiping, Lu Xi, Yuan Qijing, the dead dog and the devil rooster had used this sword to kill many swordsmen in Aoyama. He and Taiping had used this sword to destroy the ancestral altar of the mysterious dark sect. 300 years ago, the former emperor faked his death and entered the Guoqing temple to become a monk. The emperor succeeded the throne unwillingly. In order to comfort his nephew, Jingjiu gave the first child sword to him as a gift. 300 years later, the emperor lent the first child sword to Zhao Leu, who killed Lo Huainan. Lu Shisui buried the first child sword under a tree, which indirectly led to the death of Shi Wang's son and the destruction of the cloud platform. Later, the first child sword was sent to the Western Sea Sword School by Guodong, which led to the destruction of the Western Sea Sword School. In the end, the sword returned to Aoyama and Jingjiu's hands. A few years ago, the emperor appointed Jing Yao as the crown prince. Jingjiu sent the first child sword to the royal palace as a gift. The experience of the first child sword was quite bizarre. It had changed hands many times over the last 1,000 years, and those people and sects who had owned it didn't end up well. It was a rather ominous experience. Jingju didn't think so. It was because those unfortunate people were his enemies, and it was just like what he told Baizhenren. This was his sword to begin with. It was even the sword he had used for the longest time. As such, he wielded the first child sword as his first sword in the battle for the throne in Zhaoga City. He had to see blood when he wielded the sword. And he had to see joy. Jing Yao walked to the front of the throne. Nobody could stop him from sitting down now. Jingju didn't sit down. Instead, he looked at Jingjiu at the door of the Grand Hall. Jingjiu took 2 steps to the outside of the Grand Hall and sat down on the stairs. He placed his right hand on his knee in a casual posture, as if he were fishing by the water. He and his nephew of the Emperor had sat and chatted here a few days ago, and they had done the same thing. Seeing the scene, Jing Yao's eyes were a bit wet. He sniffed a few times and sat on the throne. As he sat on the throne, his energy suddenly became different from before. It was not more sacred and majestic, but calmer and more determined. Led by Duke Lu, many chancellors and generals knelt down on the ground, cheering "Long live the Emperor." Some chancellors stood on the same spots in silence, neither moving nor speaking. The cheering "Long live the Emperor" reached the outside of the Grand Hall, startling the birds that had gotten up early. They flew higher and higher in the morning wind with their wings fluttering. The square in front of the Grand Hall was very wide to begin with. After the great formation of the royal palace was activated, it felt even more boundless. The edges of the square couldn't be seen, as if it were dozens of miles wide. There was not a single person in such a vast and boundless square. Only a small green curtained sedan was placed there all alone. The morning clouds outside the royal palace grew thicker, and the morning glow appeared gradually. A dozen cloud boats could be seen more clearly, exuding a sacred beauty. The boat of diligent study of Yamatsai was a bit further away. It was quiet in Zhaoga City. In the sky outside the city, a great many cultivation sects and swordsmen were on their way. Sitting on the stone steps, Jingju watched all this in silence. Then, the immortal Tan arrived. Jingju didn't get up to greet him this time. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.